Welcome back, everyone, to another episode of Apostate of Mind. I'm Mark Peralta, and today we're going to be reacting live to this very recent debate between Mr. Dinesh D'Souza and atheist Alex O'Connor, which I'm hoping that all of you watching this now know who Alex O'Connor is. He is, and if you don't know him, we've got a 20-something-year-old genius who's got the balls to stand up to Christian apologists. And this time he did it with Mr. Dinesh D'Souza, who seems to be a prolific Christian apologist, writer, author guy. He gives lots of talks. He's done lots of debates. And so we are going to be reacting live to this debate. If you haven't seen it, this would be a good opportunity for you to watch it. So without further ado, let's bring up the video feed. And this was published about 9 days ago over at Pangburn. There's a YouTube channel, Pangburn, titled, "Is the Bible True?" Which is the topic of the debate between Alex O'Connor and Dinesh D'Souza. And I'm really excited to bring this to you guys because, I'm a former Christian believer. I'm a amateur scholar of the Bible, and I take these things very seriously. And now, I spend most of my time as an atheist reacting or demystifying the Bible. And so I was very surprised to see Dinesh argue in ways that were almost unbiblical. I was very surprised to hear him say lots of things that are just not true. And, we're going to get to each and every one of those. And I'm excited to show this to you also because I think Alex did an awesome job standing up to the typical Christian apologetics that we hear from most of them. And so, in a way, I think Dinesh is he's exemplary of a tradition of modern day Christian apologetics that it's just all over the place. So if we refute him, we refute most of them. Let's get this started. Here's a little preview. Oh, I just realized I hadn't started playing yet. Here we go.
You don't think that's a contradiction?
No, it's not a contradiction at all, because the gospel writers are constantly
Contradicting each other?
No, even in the ancient world, divine revelation comes into a primitive, barbaric world, which is full of a lot of really bad guys.
And God says, keep going.
No,
Keep it up.
God does not.
That's right.
Say keep going.
The God that you believe in is acting like a tribal war god.
A Christian book has got to be understood in the way Christians understand it.
So just to ask a direct yes or no question, I'd appreciate a direct yes or no to this. The God that you believe in is the moral author of the universe, morally justifiably commanded the slaughter of innocent children and women. Yes or no?
Yes, he does.
1, 2. We're just getting the YouTube.
All right, so I'm going to skip on over
Thank
to
you all
the
for being
beginning
here.
of their
Nice
conversation.
and early.
So
We're going to get going on YouTube.
we're going to skip
yeah.
whatever they said. I want to say this might be an evangelical channel that's promoting
Great.
this
Hi, everyone.
or hosting it.
I'm not really used to doing this kind of thing without a moderator, but we've had a conversation before coming out here, and we thought it would be good to sort of give each other 10 minutes each to lay out something of a case. We're not going to be too strict with that, but and then hopefully most of the time we can dedicate to just having a chat. Dinesh said that I can go first, which seems a little odd given that he's, I suppose, technically on proposition, but I wanted to lay out a few different ways that I interpret the question and see where he wants to take it.
So just to be clear, the question of the debate is the Bible true? And so naturally, Dinesh should take the since he's given the affirmative, he is going to have to carry the burden of proof here, and therefore he should lead the debate or open the conversation. But they are flipping it, which is fine. I think he's a very generous debater. Alex is.
Some people said that I shouldn't do this debate with this question. It's kind of an impossible question. It's the kind of question that requires more of an explanation to ask than to answer, which is a little bit strange. So I thought, the Bible is not a book. It's a library. And like any good library, it contains an amalgamation of different genres. And so asking if the Bible is true, you might as well ask if the corpus of Shakespeare is true. It sort of betrays a misunderstanding of how people interact with the text. So I thought, will Dinesh argue that the Bible is literally true, historically?
I mean, he's right, because just about every book of the Bible is going to come from a different set of authors, composed throughout different times, like, centuries apart in some instances. And not only that, but many of the books in the Old Testament, for example, like Genesis, have been found by most critical scholars to contain several sources. And so it gets really complicated, because he would have to demonstrate the veracity of the authorships of these books. And it's more than 66, that's for sure. But I don't think he's going to go there. So
historically true, allegorically true, morally true, theologically true, metaphorically true. And I suppose the only thing for it is to sort of try each one on for size. So maybe beginning with
This is
Genesis,
another really important point, because the Bible does not only contain like historical narratives where those could be demonstrated, but it also contains other claims that are going to be in different conversations, like metaphorical truths or spiritual truths, things that go beyond the material world. I could say. So it gets very complicated. And where do you go, right? Where do you start?
an attempt clearly not at historicity, but rather allegory and metaphor. We can deal with one of our types of truth here. We're introduced to Adam and Eve, who were told in no uncertain terms by God not to eat of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. You may begin to wonder why knowledge of good and evil is such a bad thing, but the thought is interrupted by the introduction of the serpent, who says to Eve, did God say that if you eat of the tree, then in the day that you eat of it, you shall surely die? And Eve says, yes. And the serpent says, well, that's not going to happen. God just knows that if you eat of it, you'll become like him, knowing good and evil. And he doesn't want that. That's all. You're not going to die. So Eve famously takes the fruit, eats some, gives some to Adam, and what happens? Do they die in the day thereof? Some people say in a metaphorical sense, yes. We'll get to that in a second, but at least on the surface of it, no. What does happen? God tells us himself. He says, now the man has become like one of us, knowing good and evil. He must not be allowed to reach out his hand and eat from the tree of life, lest he inherit eternal life. And with this, Adam and Eve are banished from the Garden of Eden. So who's telling the truth here? This story is quite mystifying to me, and I'm not the first to point this out. There's actually an apocryphal gospel discovered near Nag Hammadi in Egypt in the 1940s, dated to around the 2nd or 3rd century, called the Testimony of Truth, a gospel that didn't make it into the New Testament, which identifies the serpent, interestingly, who's never called Satan in the text, by the way, identifies the serpent with Jesus. I don't know if I'd go quite that far, but it does seem that the sort of allegorical truth of the story leaves a lot to be desired.
It does. And perhaps in a world like today, where the kind of God that is preached by Christian apologists is a God that is supposed to be omniscient, that is sinless, or I don't know if he lacks the ability to sin or just has all the willpower not to sin, that it's almost inconceivable that God could be lying in scripture. But indeed, it really does. It seems to me like he is lying to Adam and Eve, because indeed, the day they ate of the fruit, they did not die. In fact, they lived for hundreds of years, well beyond what any of us would consider a very long life, perhaps too much. If I remember correctly, perhaps upwards of 800 years. So surely Adam and Eve did not die. So what really did happen? Either God lied to them, or if we're going to insist on that God is sin free and he does not lie, he's not a deceiver, that maybe they died some way. And I think that is what the apologists typically are going to do, is they're going to make some sort of way around the fact that they did not die physically, which really is the only death we know of. Like, how many deaths do people really have? Like, there is one death that we can evidence. So why should the ancient reader and anyone reading it today take something different from it? You know, so you have to consider the original audience, those who perhaps had access to this information, and what would they have interpreted from reading Genesis 3. And surely something other than not dying like they're supposed to have died happened. And so, but I have no problem conceding that Yahweh did lie to Adam and Eve here. And the reason why I would argue for that perspective is because we do have other tales, other myths from antiquity where this sort of conversation takes place between a God and his man, his created Adam. And I'm referring specifically to the myth of the Adapa and the south wind. It's a Mesopotamian myth, very, very close to Adam and Eve, where one of the gods who happens to be advising this Adam character, Adapa, he tells him kind of a lie. He says, "Don't eat of the bread and the water of Enlil that he's going to offer you once he takes you to heaven, because surely you will die." And so Adapa ends up refusing this bread of life and water of life from the main god who was offering to him, and lost his chance at attaining immortality by eating of it. And so I see why not. Why couldn't have Yahweh implemented some trickery? And I think he was perhaps justified in doing so, because he was really preventing, and if you keep on reading the text, he was preventing that that Adam and Eve could partake of the tree of life, which would give them immortality and therefore be like one of them, perhaps the divine council. Um, keep in mind that ancient Israelites were really Canaanites, and so their religious perspectives were very much like the Canaanites. They believed there was a divine council and there's a high God. Anyway, so it's he's got his reasons for lying to Adam and Eve. And so, yeah, why don't we just accept that's the case? But I am afraid Dinesh will not admit that, because his God can't lie. But we'll see.
I'm told that maybe Adam and Eve died a sort of spiritual death, or mortality entered the world. But then we need to ask why it is that God had to proactively banish them from the Garden of Eden. This isn't some natural result of sin that, mortality entered the world. They're banished. And the implication is that they could have just as easily reached out and eaten from the tree of life, but God didn't want this to happen. So he guards the gates of Eden with a cherubim, with a flaming sword.
And that is profoundly correct, because one of the main misconceptions about Genesis 3 that most people read into the text, I'd say most, the average Christian, is that Adam and Eve were somehow created immortal, like immortal. And it was not until they ate of the wrong tree that they received mortality. And that's where Christian New Testament authors will comment on this, saying things like, and sin entered the world and therefore death and whatnot. But then if that's the case, where it was like they were immortal, and sin and death had not entered the world until this happened, until the disobedience, then why would God had created this tree and planted it in the middle of the garden, this tree of life, that would otherwise give them immortality? Like, why is that there? If they were created immortal, there really is no need for a tree. And also, the banishment from the garden, like Alex is reminding Dinesh here, is also evidence that it was all about the tree. It was all about eating of that tree. So therefore, putting up a wall that would prohibit Adam and Eve from having access to it would solve that issue. So it's not like they were cursed with this death sentence, but rather they were cursed, from being able to access the tree that would otherwise sustain them living forever. Or as long as they ate of it, they would continue on living. I think that's the concept here.
I find this quite strange, and I'd like to know what Dinesh thinks of it. Moving on quickly, I suppose.
He seems so confused.
The events of the later Old Testament, skipping over Exodus, we're introduced to another form of truth that I want to potentially engage in, and that's the concept of moral truth. That's another one that I spoke about in the beginning just there, the concept of moral truth. When we look at some of the military conquests of the Old Testament, bear in mind that the promised land pledged to Abraham is not an empty plain.
I probably should speed
its
this
indigenous
up.
inhabitants had to be, shall we say, displaced by a series of military campaigns ordered by God and carried out by his prophets. Thus we have such commands as in Deuteronomy, chapter 20. When you march up to attack a city, make its people an offer of peace. Sounds promising to start with. If they accept and open their gates, all the people in it shall be subject to forced labor and will work for you. Some peace. If they refuse to make peace and engage you in battle, which, why would they do that on these terms? Lay siege to that city. When the Lord your God delivers it into your hand, put to the sword all the men in it. As for the women, the children, and the livestock, and everything else in the city, they get to go... hold on. You may take these as plunder for yourselves, that's right. And you may use the plunder the Lord your God gives you from your enemies. Likewise, in 1 Samuel, we have the destruction of the Amalekites. There's the order, now go attack the Amalekites.
And I think what he's highlighting here is also what is understood from Christian theology, is that God is also, he's highly moral, right? I think most Christians would not necessarily see their God as one, acting with malice or evil or with ill intent, but rather a morally good God. And I when I say good, I mean good to like the highest degree of good. But when we read the Bible, we don't necessarily get that same perspective, do we? By reading lots of these narratives, namely the conquest, but then other things too, you'll soon find out that the biblical God is sort of like, it doesn't coincide with this highly moral God that most Christians would say that exists. And so that being a morally true, it's a problem. Is God really this holy, 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 or not? Or is he an asshole? Is he bad? Right?
And to totally destroy all that belongs to them. I'm told sometimes that this is actually an exercise in hyperbole. God didn't mean everyone. It continues, do not spare them. Put to death men and women, children and infants, cattle and sheep, camels and donkeys. And if you think that this is hyperbole, consider what happened when Saul does conduct the destruction of the Amalekites as ordered and decides to leave alive the king as well as some of the best of the livestock. He leaves them alive. For this small act of mercy, God responds by saying to the prophet Samuel, I regret that I have made Saul king because he's turned away from me and has not carried out my instructions. So not even the animals can escape this genocide. So I'd like to ask Dinesh, I suppose, directly, which is it? Is this a morally corrupt series of events, or do I have to dispel with my moral intuition that genocide, including of innocent children, is a bad thing? There's plenty more to talk about in that regard. I don't want to take up too much time. This isn't, of course, to mention the advocacy and explicit instructions around slavery in the Old Testament. Hopefully we can get onto those too, if we want to go down the moral path. But I think that the most natural interpretation of the question is this concept of historicity, the literal truth of the Bible, that is. This is where I think we have to move to the New Testament, because the genre of the gospel seems to be historical biography, unlike the mythology of a book like the Psalms or Genesis or Job. And here there's a lot to talk about. We begin with the birth narratives. There are two birth narratives in the Gospels, in Matthew and Luke. Both give different accounts. Both have a genealogy of Jesus, for example, but the genealogies are different. I'm told this is because one records Mary's genealogy and one records Joseph's. You can do this if you like. It doesn't seem like the most natural reading of the text if you're not already predisposed to synchronize the accounts.
This is very important because he is giving the charge to Dinesh to give an answer as to the many, many issues related to the synoptic gospels, in the sense that if you do critical readings and you compare the narrative side by side, you will find out that there's lots of discrepancies among the stories, the order of some of the stories. A lot of the details are different from one account to the next. And so, like, which is the right one? I think it's what he's trying to ask here from Dinesh. And yeah, I don't foresee him being able to answer to that either, but let's see.
Then we have, for example, the flight to Egypt, which is only recorded in Luke, which is difficult to reconcile with Matthew's account that they went to the temple in Jerusalem instead. But more importantly, Matthew then says that the family traveled to Nazareth, and he says, "So was fulfilled what was said through the prophets, that he shall be called a Nazarene," quoting the prophets. Now, notice if you read an online Bible that where the Old Testament prophets are quoted, there's a little footnote telling you what the prophecy is. In this case, you won't find one, because the prophecy simply doesn't exist. It's not there. There's no such thing. So there are two options here. Either Matthew made up this prophecy or got it wrong, in which case the New Testament is mistaken, or the prophecy does exist, but for some reason fell out of our scriptural tradition and now no longer exists, which makes the accuracy and at least completeness of the Old Testament suspect. So again, I'd like to ask directly which.
Yeah, that's a huge problem too, because you think that the New Testament, since it was inspired by the same God and it's an infallible inspiration, like most Christians would argue, that the New Testament wouldn't lie to you by claiming that there is some prophecy about him being called a Nazarene. I think that if that was Matthew, I think that was Matthew or Luke. If that's what he did, it's likely because he's disagreeing with the other gospel authors like Mark. And if it's Luke, then he'd be disagreeing with Matthew in that, in terms of like where, not necessarily where Jesus was born, but like where Mary and Joseph are from. Because in one gospel, they're clearly in Nazareth, and they're forced to have the birth in Bethlehem because of the whole census and all this and that. But in the other one, they're basically starting the story in Bethlehem, as if Joseph and Mary are both residents of Bethlehem, which is is another country. It's Judea in the south. It's far. And from there, they head on over to Egypt. So it's not necessarily a contradiction, but it's a completely different story. So which is the real story? Was Jesus in Egypt as a toddler? And if so, what does that mean? What could that mean? What point could the author be trying to make with that? I mean, I could imagine that the author is trying to, and this is getting into the weeds, but I think one author is trying to paint the picture like Jesus is like this Moses character. And so he invents that story in order to make him more Moses-like, coming out of Egypt. But yeah, I guess we'll never know.
It is. Finally, I suppose I should mention the contradictions that a lot of people point to in the Gospels. Some of these, I think, are legitimate, some are not. I'll give you some examples very quickly of Gospel contradictions that I do think are real contradictions. First, the date of Jesus' crucifixion. Was it before the Passover, as John states, or was it after the Passover, as the Synoptic Gospels state? Second, Jesus is sending out his disciples to teach. In Mark, he tells them to take nothing with them except a staff. In Matthew and Luke, he says, take nothing with them, including no staff. So do they take staff or do they not? A pedantic contradiction, but a contradiction nonetheless, and one that's led people like Barnabas, Ahern to write entire articles on this. And Augustine himself actually distinguished between a literal staff and a metaphorical staff to explain this difference. Anything, I suppose, except considering the possibility of even the most minor of gospel contradictions. Third, Jesus flipping the tables at the temple. A famous story, but did you know that in the Gospel of John, this takes place at the beginning of Jesus' ministry? In the Synoptics, it takes place near the end. So when did that occur? Mary Magdalene, after the resurrection of Jesus, runs to the disciples in John's Gospel and says, they've taken the Lord, and we do not know where they have put him. Strange thing for her to say if, as the Gospel of Matthew recounts, she's visited by an angel at the tomb who tells her exactly where Jesus is going, and then she's met by Jesus herself on the way to the disciples to bring them the news. Strange for her to then say they've taken the Lord and we do not know where they put him. There's more to say on this. Interpolations, things which seem not to be in our oldest manuscripts, but end up in newer manuscripts of the New Testament, such as the adulterous woman, let he who is without sin cast the first stone. Most scholars agree that this was not in our earliest manuscripts and was added in at a later date. And if we can see that the gospel stories were edited after they were written down, there's no reason to think that they couldn't be edited before they were written down as oral traditions too, as well as the entire ending of Mark 16. There's a longer version and a shorter version, because the longer version simply isn't in our earlier manuscripts. These documents don't seem to have the historical reliability either. So in conclusion, I've probably spoken for too long here. Are we talking about allegorical truth, moral truth, metaphorical, theological truth, historical truth? I suppose what I want to say to Dinesh is take your pick, and I'll probably have something to say about it.
All right, here we go.
This is the moment where Dinesh realized that he did not prepare for this this debate as well as he should have. So get ready, folks.
If you don't mind, I'm going to stand up. Is that okay? Please. Okay. I'm standing up because I want to kind of neutralize Alex's accent advantage. I mention this because it seems to me no accident that so many of the prominent so-called new atheists have British accents. I think this is really important to their credibility because think of it, if
Excuse
Hitchens
me.
and Dawkins and Alex were three Southern boys from Louisiana, would they have quite the same impact? I'm not sure. Anyway, this is why I'm standing. I'm a little puzzled about this
that's really
topic and how to
inaccurate.
get at it, because I've never debated this topic before. I'm not a theologian. I wouldn't even say I'm an expert in the Bible. I'm, I think, a believing and intelligent Christian. And so I have done a bunch of debates over
I don't know about you folks, but I do sense a bit of nervousness coming from his voice.
the existence of God, over can God's omnipotence and benevolence be reconciled with evil in the world. Those topics appear to be philosophical topics. But when you're dealing with the Bible, you have a different kind of a work altogether. And I say this because in discussing if something is true or false, you have to ask, what is it that the book is doing? Like, what's its purpose? What is it there for? Let's take an example of what I mean. Let's say if we were debating, is Shakespeare's Julius Caesar true or false? Now, Julius Caesar is a historical account. This is not one of Shakespeare's works of fiction. It's a historical drama. But because Shakespeare's interest is in drama, he emphasizes dramatic events and dramatic confrontation. He does not actually worry about trivial details, anachronisms. If an event occurs over here, Shakespeare does not hesitate to pull it in over here because of the dramatic impact is more powerful this way. And so imagine if someone were to come along and say, well, this is untrue, because when one of the conspirators shows up to commit the crime, he is, according to Shakespeare, wearing a handkerchief.
Okay, I don't know about you guys, but that's just complete blux. You know, like, are you just comparing Bible authors with Shakespeare doing historical fiction with that book or that writing? Because what could Shakespeare speak of something that occurred like a couple of millennia prior to him leaving? So it's obvious historical fiction, and that's not what the Gospels are, unless do you think that is historical fiction? It could be. But I think that it does include enough historical points to, or I think the greater point that the Gospels are making is that these events actually did happen, not that they're allegorical. So I would argue that if Jesus' crucifixion was metaphorical or figurative, that it would completely lose all its meaning and purpose. So you can't play this game, Dinesh. So let's see.
Handkerchiefs didn't really exist in the time of Julius Caesar. This is obviously something Shakespeare got right out of Shakespearean England, stuck it right in there, didn't care about doing that because his purpose is something else, to explore the nature of tyranny, for example. And so to bring the lens of saying this is anachronistic, well, you may or may not be right, but you're like missing the point of the whole book. And you're also missing the point of the author, and you're missing the point of the reader. Meaning the author's intention is not to worry about.
So what, you're saying that your God couldn't have made his points using actual and true things? I don't buy that.
About whether or not people in ancient Rome used handkerchiefs. The point of the author is to dramatize something about the essence of tyranny and conspiracy, and maybe the conflict between tyranny and freedom. And readers of the work, understanding that, have always taken it in that spirit. So,
I don't think so. That's a mischaracterization. I mean, It depends who you ask. If you're talking to a fundamentalist Christian theologian, he would say, no, these things actually happen, like literally. So again, you're mischaracterizing how it is. There is a real problem here, and he's just dancing around it. That's all I'm seeing.
As I listen to Alex, I think to myself, let's think about the Bible, what kind of a book it is. Well, first of all, it is a book that exists sort of within a tradition and within a church. I mean, there was no Bible for 300 years, right? The early Christians get together in the 4th century, they put the Bible together. Now, there's already a flourishing church. In fact, right about that time, the Roman emperor will convert to Christianity. Christianity will become the state religion of Rome.
I mean, that's kind of inaccurate, because like to just speak of the Bible as the Christian book or the Christian version is a bit unfair, because well before the 1st century, there were groups of Jews or Israelites that did have a canon. For example, the Samaritans had a Pentateuch that it was considered their Bible. So you're just inaccurate all over the place today, aren't you, Dinesh?
And the Bible will become, this assembled Bible will become the handbook of this church. And so it is to this day. Now,
Maybe.
that's one point. The second point is that the Bible is a very strange book to be asking this kind of a question about, because the Bible nowhere admits the legitimacy of this kind of inquiry. It's worth noting. The Bible is a book of declaration, I would say of revelation. It never tries to prove anything. It could,
What?
but with very rare exceptions, and even those exceptions are generally kind of feeble, it is a book of sort of bold.
I think he completely missed the point of the Gospel of John. There's that verse that says that, I think it's towards the end, oh, that these and many more miracles took place, but these were just the ones, I'm paraphrasing here, that were written down so that you might believe, right? So it seems to me like the author or authors of the Gospel of John had that intention in mind, and you're just contradicting them.
Proclamation. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. Boom. It's declared as something true.
Yeah, and so did many other ancient religious texts also claim. Like all you need to do is Google creation accounts, and you're going to find well over 18 to 24 creation narratives that are declaring the very same things that the book of Genesis is declaring. So why should we give Genesis any more credulity versus the other ones, which in most cases they're actually older than Genesis? I mean, examples of that, the Enuma Elish. So and there's just tons more.
Now, I want to reflect on that for a moment. Before I do, let me say, if you think about that sentence by itself, it's a puzzle. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. Obviously, somebody is writing this. But who? No one was there, except God. And yet, the sentence does not say, in the beginning, I created the heavens and the earth. There's apparently an observer. And the observer is recording, and God is, in fact, in the narrative. God is, in fact, the subject of it. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. So as I think about this statement, I think that, first of all, it is an astounding claim, completely counterintuitive. And by counterintuitive, I mean, well, I get most of my intuitions from Aristotle. Aristotle, using you could call it philosophical common sense, says the universe has always been around. It's always been here. You don't need an explanation for how it got started, because it never got started. It's always existed. And the Greeks also believed, as you probably know, out of nothing can come nothing. So therefore, if you first had nothing, you get a universe. The Bible goes against this Greek tradition and states categorically, as a matter of fact, that first there was nothing, and then there was a universe because God made it.
Okay, so that he's 100% wrong on that. And he's so wrong. Just to even refer to as categorically, that's like, like it's unequivocally. Oh, that didn't come out right. But my point is that Genesis does not teach a creation ex nihilo or ex out of nothing. In fact, this is a concept that I think modern theologians later developed. I think as a result of the King James Version translation, "In the beginning, God created," because critical scholars, Hebrew scholars, will say that a better translation is more like when in the beginning of God creating the universe, or when Yahweh began to create the universe, implying that something was already there. And I think the text does describe that to be just a world of chaos, but nonetheless, a world that at the very least contained water and air, and I don't know what else. But my point being is the text doesn't really teach that there was nothing and then something came to be, but rather that the God just sort of like began forming it, like a potter takes existing clay that's been uh, in the soil forever, you could say. But at some point, the potter begins to give it shape. And that's sort of what's in mind here. This understanding was later corrupted, and it's just inaccurate. And Dinesh doesn't know otherwise. That's pathetic.
So there are some factual assertions here. The assertion that the universe had a beginning, the assertion that the universe, in a sense, came out of nothing, and of course the assertion that the universe was created by God. So we can, if we want to go down this road, I'm not going to do it right now, explore whether this astounding claim that was made by the ancient Jewish writers with no evidence at all, no empirical investigation, no scientific experiment, no attempt to measure the redshift of galaxies. Nevertheless, the ancient Hebrew writer says, we know this to be true because God told us.
We believe this to be true, but that's about it. Like, just what are you saying, Dinesh? That because it's such a bold claim that somehow that makes it true? I don't see what your point is.
And now here we are, more than 2,000 years later, really more like 3,000 years later, and we're in a position to ask, is this claim true? So I'll defer that. I'm happy to discuss that, and probably will. But this is one way to think about whether what the Bible says is true. It's making these categorical assertions. And most of these assertions, I would argue, are in the domain of revelation. The Bible is, in fact, a revelation. A revelation. Right here we have a problem, because how does one approach a revelation philosophically?
No. So, okay, let us suppose that the Bible is a revelation. Okay. Is that revelation true? Is the content, is the message of the revelation something that is part of reality, that corresponds to reality? Okay, so don't try to bend it somewhere else.
Alex, you just tell me when I'm out of time. Okay, I'm just going to go until you stop me.
3 minutes, I think.
I'm okay?
3 minutes, wasn't it?
I got 3 minutes. Oh, wow. It's just getting started. All right. I'll save some of my stuff. But let me just say this. What is the point of revelation at all? We have a guy here who says he's a cosmic skeptic. Many people, I think, are skeptics. And so you might ask, well, why the heck do we need revelations? We have reason. Well, turns out that here we are, flung into the world. And if we reflect upon this fact and reflect upon our place in the world, several important questions pop out that are the inevitable result of reason, but which reason is utterly incapable of answering. Not that reason has an answer to date. Reason cannot answer. What are these questions? 1, why is there a world?
Oh, gosh.
2, what is our purpose in it? Why?
So he's just going to like turn preachy on us. It reminds me of Ravi Zacharias, who would also do the kind of like the same kind of argument, a moral argument, and circumvent, right, the fact that there is no evidence to support like those bold claims that the Bible makes, that even Dinesh had something to say about it.
Intelligent person, I think, can avoid having to raise, and yet to which there is no available or even conceivable answer. It's not as if there's no answer, but we'll get an answer tomorrow. Because let me put it this way. Let's take the question about life after death. And I'll close on this and open the door to further inquiry. Let's talk about life after death. Is there life after death, yes or no? Shakespeare says that death is the undiscovered country. No traveler who has gone there has ever come back.
Yeah, because we so care about what
Might get some tiny
Shakespeare
hint
has
of
to say
experience.
on
But by
this.
and large, we don't know. And not only do we not know, we have no way of knowing. The key point here is that probability, the absence of evidence is the evidence of absence. This is all gobbledygook. Because all of this is only based on prior experience. If you show me a guy and tell me he has 3 eyes, I won't believe you. Because I've seen thousands of people, maybe hundreds of thousands of people, and I've got a lot of experience, and based upon that, the probability that a guy can show up with 3 eyes may seem to me to be pretty low. But the question of life after death, if I think of an analogy for it, it's something more like the possibility of aliens. It's not even an exact analogy, but it's a similar analogy because if I say to Alex, you believe in aliens, there's no probabilistic way to say yes. We have nothing in our experience to go this way or that way.
No, I'm sorry, but if the mothership lands tomorrow and aliens come out of it, I think that would be evidence enough that they're actually indeed they exist. But life after death, it's a problem because you kind of have to be dead in order to really experience it. And even that, like, how would you know that's actually our reality? Like, there's just no way. Regardless, though, this is sort of irrelevant. Alex O'Connor presented very clear challenges to the Christian apologists here that relate to the Bible itself, right? The question is the Bible true? So let's consider truth claims in the Bible, and provide evidence to support them. But that's not what the apologist is doing. I would argue is because he doesn't have an answer. And so here we are, just skating around the issue.
And here's my point. It is exactly when reason not only breaks down, but reason can't even go there, that revelation steps in and delivers an answer. And here we are debating, is that answer true? And the question I want us to think about, at least to get started tonight, with what tools are you going to deliver a true or false verdict on subjects that are outside the domain of reason itself?
I mean, he kind of already told you, he gave you different examples of what those could be and said, take your pick. Let's talk about any of them, right? Historicity, allegorical truths, metaphorical truth claims, spirituality claims, you name it. Let's talk about it. Dinesh is just BSing.
So what I want to emphasize here, and I'm happy to discuss all the specifics we've covered today, or Alex has covered today, but essentially the Bible is something that is taught in church. It's a tool for ministry, for exhortation, to get people to live better lives, to help them deal with their life in the world. I have never heard a single pastor, for example, and I'm quite sure this doesn't happen in Jewish synagogues as well, going, you know what, let's go out and find the Amalekites of our day and kill them right now. Nobody says that. No one even thinks that.
Maybe,
Nobody
but
reads the passage of the fall in the way
I
that
don't
Alex
think
described
that
it.
reflects
So we have a
all of history.
We got a book. It's a book that exists within a community for a purpose that the community is extremely clear about. This book is used every single Sunday, millions of times and all around the world. It's used in Protestant and Catholic churches. Obviously, there are interpretive communities that differ in how things can be read and understood. There's also the whole separate question of the relationship of the Old Testament to the New. There's an old saying that goes that the New Testament is in the Old concealed. The Old Testament is in the New revealed. So
Yeah, I've heard that before. And, the whole thing about that, the New Testament is in the Old Testament, but concealed, is in fact an admission of a very frowned upon practice among Bible interpreters, which is to read into the Old Testament Christianity. This is known as eisegesis, which is where you are basically reading the Old Testament through Jesus-colored eyeglasses. And that's not how you read or interpret the Bible, sir. The Hebrew Bible is a text in itself, and is actually its own best interpreter. So the meaning of text ought to come from the text itself, not through layering other concepts that come much later. Those are anachronisms, and this is not the way to read the Bible, unfortunately.
Well, the Old Testament and the New exist in a kind of odd relationship to each other. In fact, so odd that one party, the Jews, repudiates the relationship altogether. And from the Christian point of view, the Old Testament is incorporated but superseded by the New. And there are different ways of looking at that.
Yeah, it's kind of like if you're a Christian and you go to the Mormon church, right? They are going to have an Old Testament. They're going to have a New Testament, but they're also going to have the Book of Mormon, among many other writings that came from that Mormon early on tradition. And it's sort of like the same thing. Like if you Christians are simply adopting or kidnapping the Hebrew Bible into their Bibles, because that's not their tradition, but they're taking it as if it's theirs.
That relationship, which we can get into.
Which
Let me just
I don't
start by saying
agree.
this.
Rather long 3 minutes there.
Oh, it's a rather long 3 minutes.
It's maybe meant you finish soon in the way that Jesus promised.
No.
to come
Let
back
me
soon.
pause. Let me pause right here because
And ambiguous soon. But I'd love to question you on some of the things you've already said.
all right,
Don't
let's
mind.
we'll put the ball in your court.
Yeah, because
So
he
I think what's
totally
going to happen
did not
now
address
is we're gonna go into
anything
discussion.
Alex said.
Hope so.
Right? Okay, and you're going to ask me some questions. We'll discuss, and I'll ask you some.
Sure, and I'm happy to essentially take the things that I said in my opening statement and slot them in and apply them to the things that you just said right there. So you began by saying that the Bible is a strange book to ask these questions of because of its purpose. I assume you'd agree with me that the Bible is a collection of books rather than a singular text, with different authors, different intentions, and most importantly, different genres. So the first question I suppose I'd like to ask you is, do you agree, for example, that at least some biblical texts are attempts at historical biography, such as in the Gospels?
Of course, I would agree with that. But let me just qualify it this way.
Sure.
When we think of the Bible as revealed, the question now becomes, what do we mean? Did God write the book? Did God inspire the book and human beings wrote it? Did God show human beings events that they then described in their own words? Okay, so the reason these things are important is it seems to me, to answer the question I raised earlier about in the beginning God created heaven and earth, the way I understand it is there's a perfect revelation shown to a gospel, to a Bible, to a Jewish scribe who sees it, so to speak, but
There's a perfect revelation. You see how this is all made up?
writes it in his own words. When I look at the book of Revelation, same thing.
And does it get anything wrong? Do the scribes get anything wrong?
It's quite possible that they, when you say get anything wrong, they are writing it in human terms. I mean, you know.
I mean the specifically mundane human things. I'm not talking about when the author of Genesis says that God created the heavens and the earth, or talks about the spirit moving across the face of the water. This is clearly mythological. This is clearly an attempt at mythological writing. That's fine. It would be silly to ask if that's true or not. But when somebody,
I don't think it is mythological writing at all. I think that it is simply, let me put it this way.
Okay, so it's not mythological. Genesis is not mythological. Then if it's not, then he has the burden to demonstrate how these events actually did take place.
If we were in the year 4000 BC, if we were John the Divine, and let's just say that God showed us in a vision the actual end of the world, right? Apocalypse. We would then write down the 4 horsemen of the apocalypse, death and famine and destruction. We're not engaging in myth making at all. I'm actually writing what I see.
so you think there'll be a 7-headed demon?
Of course not. I'm saying that to me, what I'm seeing is so. Let's just say, for example, it is a thermonuclear explosion
Sure.
of a kind that the ancient Bible writer doesn't even know what it is, right? And the consequence of it is death and destruction and famine. He's going to write it down the way he sees it.
But
right?
where's he going to get the 7-headed dragon and the prostitute from?
This is his
like a human attempt to describe a nuclear reaction?
Yes, because when words and images fail, metaphor is the actual conduit to truth.
Now, I'd understand if that were the case if you said that
I mean, those are the limitations of communication, right? It's sort of like the phrase, a picture shows 1,000 words or something equals 1,000 words. But it sounds to me like what Dinesh is trying to do here is that perhaps the ancients that wrote down these things, that they were giving like the perfect revelation, like he says it, or he labels it, and that they just simply interpret it to the best of their ability. And so that gives them room to get things wrong. Oh, so that's too easy. That's way too easy. But because you also are going to have to be able to demonstrate how it is that these revelations were perfect and true. Like how do you actually know that it was a nuclear bomb, as you're trying to illustrate with that, versus let there be light? a spoken spell. Like, I'm not following you.
Perhaps after a nuclear blast, somebody describes it as the gods of fire descending upon man with their flaming swords or something like that. But like a prostitute and a seven-headed dragon?
Well, first of all, I'm not saying it is a nuclear explosion. The problem is we're given this admittedly
Revelation, by the way.
phantasmagorical future account, right? It is so wrenching and powerful that many people, for example, have tried to render it by art, and it's not easy to do it, right?
Yeah, so
Because
he's kind of
You have
like
to stop and realize, first of all,
this
the
is
way we
a bit
acknowledge
of
the
special
limitations
pleading too,
of perception,
and
or the
that
limitations of language. Let me
reality
give you a simple
can
example.
work this way.
I come to America from India. I have never eaten a mushroom. Okay.
But I mean,
And
that's
I
just
ask
not
you,
how
Alex,
history is
what is
ever
a mushroom to you?
discussed.
Sure.
I would submit that you would be completely unable to render to me in words, however lengthy and ornate, what a mushroom actually tastes.
That may be true.
You know, like did Moses really cross the Red Sea? Right? I mean, how allegorical could you get with that illustration or that revelation? You know, so is it possible that a god through some spell was able to like divide the waters of the Red Sea? You know, assuming it actually is the Red Sea, because there are some scholars that have pointed out that it's not, it's more of like their sea of reeds, not the Red Sea, and that's a totally different scenario. It's more of a think of like shallow waters versus a raging river, or an ocean, I should say. So the burden is on you, Mr. Apologist. What evidence do you have that such thing historically occurred?
But I was asking, for example, about Jesus' presentation at the Temple of Jerusalem after his birth. This is not like trying to describe a mushroom or the end of the world.
No.
This
Okay,
is-
so now let's talk about that.
Hold on a second. This is a historical event that's being recorded by one New Testament writer.
Yeah.
At the same time as another New Testament writer says that the family had traveled to Egypt. I don't think this is an attempted metaphor or allegory, as I would say of Genesis. Whether you think that is or not, I would say that in the case of the Gospels, we can agree that in at least some instances, this is a clear attempt at mundane history. This is not an attempt at writing some kind of metaphor to explain a truth that's otherwise unknowable to the human mind. It's a very straightforward attempt to record what actually happened, and they contradict each other.
They contradict each other because they're written by four different people.
Sure.
If,
So
no,
what's
so
wrong?
let me ask you this: if God were writing it, I'm quite sure he would have written it once. You would need four.
Sure.
Okay?
So some of them are wrong then.
No. Okay. So when you say they're wrong, let's consider Luke's gospel for a minute. Luke is a medical.
If God would write it, then there would only be one. Really? How do you know that? And why wasn't that the case to begin with? We wouldn't be here arguing the credibility of the Gospels as historical accounts of the life of this Jesus of Nazareth, whom you place such high importance in your religion.
Doctor. Luke is not present at the events being described.
Mhm.
Luke is virtually in the position of Thucydides writing the Peloponnesian War. Now, Thucydides did fight in the war, but in most of the events described by Thucydides in the Peloponnesian War, he wasn't there.
Making them very unreliable, right?
No, on the contrary, it is in
Yes.
fact the most reliable account of the Peloponnesian War.
Yeah, that's right. Because the Gospels are not like these eyewitness accounts like most apologists would have you believe, but rather they're like the accounts of people who heard, the stories repeated, and at some point they got written down, because it's not like the actual disciples that wrote these things. All of the Gospels or the synoptics are like anonymous, and their authorship has been well questioned by scholars, and so that's a problem in itself.
Let's not say that it is reliable, though.
No, it is. What I'm trying to say is that when you're talking about historicity, and you're talking about historicity now in the ancient world, you have to recognize that these people are not approaching it as modern historians. Luke is going around interviewing people.
So let me ask this very, very straightforwardly then.
Okay.
Luke says that after the birth of Jesus, the family fled to Egypt.
Yeah, this is actually absolutely not true. I counted, and I think during the first century, there were about 24 to 28 actual historians contemporary to Jesus that could have actually sat down and interviewed people and written down an account, a historical account that could have been accepted as like, hey, maybe this is very true. But indeed, it didn't take place. There's really nothing within like the first and maybe middle of the second century that comes from an actual contemporary historian that like many do still today. They would have ancient historians did provide accounts and did provide evidence and did preface historical narratives with caveats and warnings, like, hey, perhaps I didn't personally interviewed the actual eyewitness, but I interviewed so and so who got it from so and so, and they would actually be upfront about things like this. This is not what we get from the Gospels. The Gospels already assume like they're telling you something that's true, without any actual preambles or anything that would kind of give them like will give the readers the understanding that they're actually doing history.
Matthew says that they went to the Jerusalem temple. Are they both correct, or is one of them wrong?
Who the heck cares? I mean, look,
I do. And so
well, you do,
probably
but,
people who are
but let me
listening to the
say
debate
let me
about
say
what the Bible is
why
true.
let me say why what you care about is not only trivial but indicates a kind of unwillingness to try to get what the text is trying to
I'll tell you why I
communicate.
don't think it's trivial.
Why
Because
it's
I think
not
that the
trivial?
reason why Luke may have invented the flight to Egypt, he tells us. Luke says, when he records the flight to Egypt, and then they return from Egypt, he says, this is so that we can fulfill the prophecy from Hosea chapter 11, out of Egypt I shall call my son. Now, in Hosea, God is talking here about the nation of Israel. At least in this case, unlike the Matthew prophecy, the prophecy actually exists and we can interrogate it. It seems to me like what Luke is doing here
That's correct.
is as a fulfillment of the Old Testament prophecy. And in fact, he tells us that that's what he's doing. Therefore, if it is the case that Jesus didn't go to Egypt and didn't come out of Egypt on his return, then this would undermine Luke's attempts to identify Jesus as the Jewish Messiah, fulfillment of the Old Testament prophecy.
That means the gospel writer lied to you.
But I think that the
Would you agree with that? I mean, do you think it's a completely trivial point? If it's so trivial,
no, I think that the point
why
as
is it included in the
the
first
point
place?
as you stated it before is trivial. The point you're now raising is not trivial, but the point you're now raising is one in which you have 3 centuries of Jewish Christian disputation about whether Jesus is the Messiah. Okay, and by and large, the disputation breaks down in this way: the Jews are the biblical literalists, and the Christians are the sort of metaphorical readers. And I say this because let's take a very famous passage that bears on this very topic, where Jesus is talking about the destruction of the temple.
Yeah, this is totally not true. The first believers of Jesus, you could argue, or not you could argue, but academics will argue that these were apocalyptic Jews.
Jesus says, no, you're misreading me completely. When I said the temple, I was actually speaking of the temple of my body.
But he doesn't tell them that.
But this is stated.
We're told that that's what he means.
We're told that's what he means. So what I'm getting at is here you have a case where you have an event, you have a Jewish literalist reading and a Christian metaphorical reading. Yeah. Another example, and you know.
So would you say then?
That's not true. Jews have and they continue to engage with the text in metaphorical ways. So that's just not accurate at all. If you read things like the Talmud, the Mishnah, there's stuff that came out of the Dead Sea Scrolls, you will find that Jews in antiquity, ancient Israelites, engaged with metaphor, and this whole thing about literal versus metaphorical, that's just not accurate at all. I don't know where he got that.
Metaphor? Is that what you're trying to say? In other words, I'm trying to understand what it is that you're doing here to actually answer the question that I'm asking you, which is about, because here's my theory, here's an idea.
Okay.
Luke, the author of Luke, invents the flight to Egypt in order to identify Jesus as the Jewish Messiah, meaning that when we read Luke, we should note that where it appears that he's making historical claims, we should note his willingness to twist history in order to fulfill a theological
Well, you don't know if he's doing that. You're assuming that. This is your theory.
No. What I'm saying is that that's one thesis to explain the contradiction between Luke and Matthew. If you want to say that it's trivial, then fine, but we still have to explain how it comes about. And what I'm saying is one idea of how this comes about leads to us undermining our trustworthiness of Luke. What I'm asking you for is your explanation that would not lead to us having to undermine the trustworthiness of Luke.
I don't have the ability to referee that passage. I'm not aware of this contradiction. I'll have to go back and look and see.
That's fine.
Go and look it up. But what I am doing is I'm questioning your methodology. And
yeah, no, what he doesn't know is that essentially what's happening is that Mark was written first, and then Matthew and Luke followed after. And I see that Matthew and Luke have in many times either disagreed with Matthew or each other, or disagreed with Mark. And so they're going to add additional details or change stories as they see fit, almost as if they are competing historiographies in a sense. And that's why they differ so greatly, is because they seem to disagree, and so they change the stories.
You're kind of what would I call it? You got the Jews and the Christians arguing about events, and they're very complex events, and they're very powerful.
Which, by the way, is not a good thing. I'm not saying that makes it more credible. I think that makes it even more suspicious that this is actually a true thing.
Something to the effect of.
And by the way, I'm not saying that I'm a mythicist. I do believe that some things did occur,
Now, in a Jewish reading,
and
this whole thing
specifically
about the
to Jesus, that
here's
you know he
Abraham,
was a
he's
man
willing
that
to
was
sacrifice his
around
son.
and
God says stop. It's a tale of
an
obedience.
apocalyptic preacher,
And
a
the Christian reading
rabbi,
is not that.
someone
It's not
who
only that. The Christian
essentially you know was in Judea preaching, and then because of being accused of crimes against the Roman Empire, like sedition, at the time, you know, the Roman Empire did not really have any mercy for those who could potentially create riots, start rebellions, and it really does seem like this Jesus character was someone who was creating problems, and so therefore he was crucified. But beyond that, then we just have myth.
guy who thought it happened over here, but in fact, you know, this guy says the roof was thatched, but another guy says they let the guy in through the roof who had to be healed. Contradiction. And I'm like, is this your way of trying to say the Bible is not true?
Yes, it is. The Old
It is,
Yes,
okay.
it's precisely what I'm doing. The Old Testament is not fully mythological. I think Genesis is mythological. I think that Exodus makes more of an attempt at history, but has mythological undertones. I think that the military conquests I mentioned in my opening statements are attempts at describing literal historical events. I think
I
that
agree.
Psalms are poetry. I think that Job is mythology. I don't think a man called
I
Job
agree.
actually existed, right? And so there are lots of different genres here. The reason I'm asking about the contradictions in the gospel, and I understand if you don't want to talk about the specific example of Egypt and Jerusalem, fine, whatever. Maybe you can send me an email about it later or something. That's fine. But the reason I bring it up is to say that there are lots of these, and in each case, if we try to look at why they might be contradicting each other, the reasons I think we're given tell us that the historicity of this text should be in dispute. For example, I mentioned the date of Jesus' death. The Synoptic Gospels specifically place this after the Passover meal. They have the Last Supper as the Passover meal.
Okay.
John uniquely sets it before the Passover because he has the theological purpose of wanting to depict Jesus as the Passover lamb.
Mhm.
Now, this is a contradiction if the Gospels are supposed to be historical accounts of what happened to Jesus, which I imagine if we were having a debate about whether Christianity were true, about whether the God of the Bible existed, you might put forward, say, an argument for the resurrection of Jesus. You might say, well, we have good historical evidence to think that Jesus rose from the dead, and you might point to the story of the crucifixion and the disciples seeing him after he died. This is a common thread. The problem is that if we're treating it as historical in an area like that, then we have to engage with it as a historical text. Why would they contradict each other? I would say for the same reason that Luke contradicts Matthew in birth narratives, because they're attempting to make a theological point, which tells us at least, and maybe you think that the New Testament is an entirely theological and in no way a historical text. Would you agree at least that the New Testament writers are seemingly willing to adapt the historicity of an event in order to serve a theological point? Would you agree with that?
Yes and no. I would agree that.
Yes and no.
Well, that definitely is a contradiction.
Well, it's not a contradiction because, well, I mean, Thucydides is relaying historical events to make a moral point about the nature of politics, and both are completely consistent with each other. Sure. It's not as if Thucydides is, so he's a student of.
Yeah, but here's the main difference, though, Dinesh, and that is that the New Testament authors also make an emphasis, a very strong emphasis of that Christians ought to believe in that Jesus was crucified and he was buried and he was resurrected on the third day. And that is the basis for their belief. Like, if you don't accept that as truth, and I think they mean historical truth, otherwise, like, why are we wasting our time? That you would then go to hell if you don't, that you don't really become part of the flock unless you believe those historical points. And so you do have to accept, Dinesh, that there is the burden of proof here is on the gospel authors. And I'm anxious to see what you're going to say now, because you just have one a way to circumvent everything that he's objecting to you about.
Our politics, he is making a point. His speeches are driven at making a point, but the point is excavated out of the actual events. Now, I think that there's a reason that we're given 4 perspectival accounts of Jesus's life, and they're not identical. In fact, as I say, if they were identical, you wouldn't need 4. The point of reading these, and I think the way to read them. Let me say a word. If you want to determine veracity, you have to operate a little bit like a jury, and by that I mean. Pick up the Gospel of Mark, the first of the Gospels. Now, by the way, these Gospels are written very proximate to the events they describe. And I say this by the standards of, we're talking about historicity of any historical document.
70 AD, would you say, for Mark?
Yes, I mean, I would say within decades of the events that they describe.
But crucially, would you agree with most historians that this happened, for example, after the destruction of the Jerusalem temple, thereby allowing the author of Mark to put the prediction in the words of Jesus' mouth without doing anything miraculous?
This is a highly debated point because Mark's gospel leaves off incomplete and has what seems to be at the very end an added section. I don't want to debate that little fragment of Mark. Here's what I'm getting at. If you've never read the Bible, and we've all read the Bible in a way.
It doesn't matter because Matthew, Luke, and John do place Jesus' death, in that same perspective. So whether Mark spoke of resurrected Jesus accounts in the end of his life, it's sort of besides the point.
I was raised Catholic, and so I was habituated to going to Sunday Mass and sort of felt like I hadn't gotten to the Bible. I've heard these stories read and so on. But it was a completely different experience for me as an adult to go back with critical skepticism and just read the book of Mark straight through. It has the complete ring of authenticity. And I say this because not only does it give you little details that don't really seem to even belong there. It's clearly not written with a polemical purpose exclusively. Mark will tell you things that not only seem irrelevant, but at other times undermine what he's trying to say. And that is the true ring of authenticity. Because if someone would... What's that?
An example?
Well, here's an example. In the...
that's not the true ring of authenticity. I mean, that's maybe a possibility. That's something to consider. But that's not necessarily, a telltale that this is a true account.
Jewish tradition, the testimony of a woman was considered inherently suspect, but the testimony of men generally reliable. And therefore, not that the testimony of women is disregarded altogether, but you needed, for example, many women to say the same thing.
I have actually heard that's not actually the case. Scholars have been saying that to us for centuries, but I've heard also arguments against that. So
now, the Gospels tell us that when Jesus was crucified and put in the tomb, if I were Mark and I were Luke and I were trying to be inventive and I were trying to establish a truth for posterity, I would not have it that a group of, let's just say, hysterical women, Mary Magdalene, whoever it was, a group of women go to the tomb and they are the ones who find the tomb empty. This is like a little dubious because most people think, well,
such an ignorant thing to say, by the way. I apologize to my audience.
That would only make sense if that was actually the way it happened.
Well, allow me to answer that, if I may.
Go ahead.
If I may. This is a commonly presented argument for the historicity of the resurrection, which, by the way, now we're talking as...
Well, I'm not... No, hold on. I didn't say it's an argument for the historicity of the resurrection. I said it was an argument...
Let me say a word.
Okay.
Now we're talking about these texts. They are historical texts. The thing about the women is, look, this is quite straightforward to me. Who anoints bodies? Who goes to tombs and anoints bodies after someone dies? It's not men, it's women. And so if the authors of the Gospels had the men go to the tomb to anoint the body, which is what Mary and the other women were doing when they went to the tomb,
that's true.
That itself would be very strange and give us reason to doubt the historicity of the events. In other words, it's like, if there's a task that women do, and that task is how Jesus' empty tomb is discovered, then why would he invent it? Why would they invent a story that has men going and doing it? Secondly, you said that you need multiple women's testimony. How many women go to the tomb? Multiple. Thirdly, what do the women do immediately after seeing the empty tomb? They run and tell the men who come and verify it for us. Right. So I don't think that this fulfills the criterion of embarrassment at all. In fact, I think the opposite is true. I think that if this was an invented story, I'm not saying it is, by the way, but if it were, then of course we could expect the people who discover the empty tomb to be women, because it's women who go to anoint the body at the tomb.
Okay, so let's put together what I just said and you just said, and let's ask the question, based upon what you said and what I said, did it happen that way? And I would submit that what you have done, see, you're doing special pleadings. You could argue I'm doing special pleadings, but I would admit that the thrust of the Bible and the thrust of the story is, in fact, aimed at delivering a truth from revelation.
That's fine.
What you're trying to do is saying, all right, I can't contest that because that's out.
No, what special pleading? That's basically the custom. The custom was that, these women from the family would come out and they would anoint the body and change out the wraps or whatever. Which means this would have been the most natural course of action. This is what would have made the most sense. Had it been differently, it would have been a little suspicious. So why should that be given any credit as to its historicity? Like, that's completely irrelevant. Give me an eyewitness, some evidence outside of the Bible that could corroborate the claim that these women went inside the tomb and all that. That's what we're looking for, not just some sort of philosophical justification for that being the case.
Outside the domain of reason, but what I'm going to do is I'm going to adopt sort of the nitpicking strategy, and because we got 4 accounts,
hold on, you're the one who brought that up. You're the one who said that
I did.
Women discovering,
and I'm saying nothing you've said has even slightly refuted it.
You don't think anything I just said refuted the idea that would be something you wouldn't expect from the gospel authors if it were invented?
No, here's what I'm saying. I'm saying that let's look at what we agree on, what we disagree on. You agree that in that culture, the testimony of women in general counts for less.
I think this is something that Josephus tells us, but it's impossible to know what sort of culturally people actually thought at the time. It's impossible for us to know. But I'm happy to grant it. Yeah, sure.
It's impossible for us to know, even though Josephus says it. Okay,
but that's in a court of law, right?
No, but what I'm saying is, if you're applying these, it's impossible for us to know, I would suggest to you, it is impossible for us to know that it was the absolute and unwavering.
Yeah, because even Josephus, we do have to be a little skeptical reading what he's written, because we do know that he could have been a little biased. He did work for the the emperor, so even though he's advertised as a Jew, I think he was also a Roman citizen. So there could have been some inclinations to sort of like bend the truth a little bit. And so scholars don't necessarily take what he says like it's scripture or anything like that. It's everything is to be questioned.
Duty of women to provide all the ointments. You stated that as a fact.
No,
and I would say it's impossible for us to know.
What I'm saying is that if somebody's reading this text and you say, well, if this were invented, why would it be women who discover the tomb? That would be embarrassing for them, the so-called embarrassment criterion. I'm saying, would it not be just, it's not the fact that we're told why they're going to the tomb to anoint the body. Is this not just reason enough?
No.
I mean, look, I'm not the one claiming I know how this went down, by the way. And also, you just accused me a second ago of special pleading. I wanted to ask you what it was that I'm specially pleading.
Well, what I'm saying is that you have an event. These events are described with great precision and a sort of eyewitness presence there. Now, we know in some cases there weren't eyewitnesses, but they're nevertheless described, this is the way it happened. And 4 guys are telling you their point of view, right?
Yeah, none of them the women who actually discovered the tomb, by the way.
No, you're not hearing from the women. I agree. You're 4 male gospel writers, apparently. Now, I lost my train of thought for a second. Sorry.
I also don't want to get too caught up on this specific example, but I suppose we'll have to sort of leave it with the audience in the live stream. The point that I'm trying to make is that the historicity of at least some of this is important for Christianity. The historicity of the life of Jesus. Like if it were discovered historically speaking that the man called Jesus never existed, that would completely undermine Christianity.
Are you saying that?
No, I'm not saying
okay.
that. Okay,
let me ask you a different question.
I'm saying that historically it matters. The crucifixion, the resurrection, these are matters which historically matters Christians. And so when we're dealing with a historical account of what happened, when they're riddled with contradictions, I think that that's a problem. If you don't think that's a problem, then that's fine. But I think that the people listening and wanting to find out if the Bible is true might see that as reason to undermine the trust of the text.
No, first of all, almost everything that we know about those events in terms of modern historical reliability, for example, where is the site of Jesus's crucifixion? Unknown. Disputed. There are a couple of potential sites, but it's not known. What day of the year was Jesus born? Unknown. We think Jesus lived for 33 years, but let's say that one of the Gospels said it was 33 and the other one said it was 34. Do you think that would actually refute Christianity?
No.
Hey guys, I'm gonna come off camera for just a minute, but I'll continue playing this for you guys.
No, it would not. It would actually be quite understandable that you'd have 2 guys, and they would get that, and they'd be off on that, and this contradiction would be trivial because the issue is not whether Jesus lived for 33 or 34 years old.
Right,
the issue is something.
That's a different kind, because if you could tell me that the reason why they had specifically chosen those ages was to serve a theological point, knowing that they're willing to sort of adapt history in order to make a theological point, I wouldn't say that point alone undermines Christianity. What I would say is that it undermines our trustworthiness in the Bible. I'm not saying that any one of these contradictions can tell us Christianity is false.
No, but I'm saying
firstly, the question is not if Christianity is true, it's whether the Bible is true. It may be the case that the man called Jesus came down to earth, rose from the dead. It's just that the gospel accounts get the details wrong, which means that the Bible is not correct. But
no, it doesn't mean
that is true. It means that Christianity is true, but the Bible is false. That's perfectly consistent.
I'm simply saying that what you're doing is you are supplying a motive that is completely made up, and that I could engage in exactly. Let's just take, for example, the 33 versus the 34 years. Now, here's what I'm saying. If there was such a contradiction, and I were being you, I would say, oh, the reason that Matthew said it was 33 is because 3 is the number of the Trinity. And so 33 has a certain theological resonance because 3 and 3 is 33. Hold on. And then I would come around and say, well, the reason the other guy said 34 is actually 3 plus 4 is 7. God made the world in 7 days. 7 is known to be a number fraught with theological significance. And I'm saying this is basically Alex BS.
Dinesh, the gospel writers tell us that's why it happened. They say that the reason the family went to Egypt was to fulfill the prophecy of Hosea.
Okay, and
so in other words, if the gospel writers, and now imagine that the gospel writers had written what you just said. Imagine in the actual text, one of them said he was 33 when he died because of the number 3 in its significance.
Correct.
And another said that he was 34 because of the number 4 in its significance. That would be a contradiction. And not, and in that instance, not just a historical contradiction, but a spiritual and theological one too.
Actually, no, it actually wouldn't.
Oh, come on.
It wouldn't. I'll tell you why.
You don't think that's a contradiction?
No, it's not a contradiction at all, because the gospel writers are constantly
contradicting each other.
No, drawing, not contradicting.
I mean, it would. It would certainly would, because if one of the gospel authors is sort of leaning more towards the whole concept of the scapegoat that takes place during Yom Kippur, the Day of Atonement, or are we talking about the sacrificial lamb of Passover? These are 2 very distinct festivals that are celebrating completely different contexts. One in one sense, it's a concept that's dealing with the sin of the people, unresolved, unsacrificed sin for the purposes of a national type of forgiveness, sort of a festival. The other one is pointing back at a historical event claimed in Genesis and in Exodus more so, pertaining the Exodus with Moses and that salvific event, whatever that was. And so, and these things were celebrated on separate days. So you're telling me that the gospel authors feel like they have the freedom to twist the truth about when Jesus actually was crucified, because it's more important to make a theological point by having him dying on one day versus the other day? I find that problematic. I'm more interested in like if it actually happened and when it did happen. But if we're gonna change the days, we're gonna change the details. That's already raising flags, folks.
If they were constantly contradicting each other, you wouldn't have spent half an hour on a single event that, frankly, I haven't even heard of. In fact, no one's ever heard of. I've never ever heard anyone discuss this in any context. So we fish out this prophecy about Hosea. I'll go back and look at all this. But what I'm trying to get at is, if you had a plethora of contradictions, you wouldn't be spending the entire debate on one that I'm sure no one in the audience has heard of either. But okay, you've heard of it. Probably because you've been listening to his YouTube channel. Right?
You don't think that this is a highly discussed point of contention in the Gospels? That the flight to Egypt is contradiction with
the flight to Egypt. Look, the flight to Egypt is an important event.
Okay, Dinesh, also you said, why could you only bring up this one example? Take your pick. The date of Jesus' crucifixion, whether they're to take a staff or not to take a staff, the dating of Jesus flipping the tables at the temple, Mary Magdalene and what she says at the tomb, when the temple curtain rips. In the Gospel of Luke, it says that this happens before Jesus' death, and in the Gospels of Matthew and Mark, it says that it happens afterwards. Like, we can go through any of these contradictions that you like, but the problem is that what you're going to tell me is that it's trivial, and then when I try to explain that it's not trivial, you say, oh, well, I haven't even heard of it, and no one else really cares about this. When other people do, by the way, this is a highly discussed point of contention in the Gospel. All I'm asking you to do is say that when I mentioned the staff in my opening statement, and I said that whether or not they take a staff is a totally trivial contradiction. I'm not bothered by that. If I were a Christian, I would say, yeah, of course, because the texts are not going to perfectly accord. But for some reason, Augustine could not accept this, and so comes up with this ludicrous idea of a literal staff and a metaphorical staff that Jesus is talking about. If you were willing to just say, yes, this is a contradiction, but that doesn't upset the method of Christianity, I think it would be a much more defensible and respectable approach. But instead, it seems that you're unwilling to admit that there's even a single contradiction in these texts.
I am saying that the texts are written from 4 different points of view.
Do they contradict?
And it is quite possible that on details, Matthew tells you things that are not in Mark or different than Mark, contradict Mark.
Contradict Mark.
Yes, contradict Mark. And so the point is, here's my point. You're acting, look at it this way. You would be scoring a point if you could say, God wrote 4 books and they contradict each other. Just like if you're able to say, Dinesh said this in the beginning of the debate and that at the end of the debate, Dinesh is contradicting himself. On the other hand, if we have 2 guys who are here today to go and write an account of this debate, right? And then we look at their accounts, which are authentic, first person. I was their accounts with a lot of detail. Yep. And one guy says, for example, the lights were dark. The other guy says the lights were dim. Or one guy says, for example, that Dinesh was sitting at a...
Yeah, Dinesh, but you're missing the point, because the repercussions of getting these details wrong can be condemning people to hell, right? So when the stakes are that high, it's not fair that there be contradictions, discrepancies, red flags, because of what's at stake here. That's the main problem. So, either Jesus resurrected from the dead or he didn't. Right? That matters.
That could well be true. But what I'm getting at is we know, just from normal experience, that if the 2 of us are sitting in a cafe and we see an accident, these kinds of differences are normal. So let's just say, for example, here's God showing us a revelation, and the revelation can be whatever it is, and you and I write an account of it, and somebody finds that my account of it not only is different than yours, but let's just say, for example, I go, oh, Jesus was wearing a cloak. Another guy goes, he's wearing a robe. For anyone to actually think that this is, in fact, a refutation of the truth of the Bible is ludicrous. So anyway, in our format, we've agreed to do a flip where you've been asking me questions now. Let me ask you something.
If you've got something to ask.
Let me turn around and ask you questions in a sort of what I think is a more fundamental mode, because it gets to what the Bible really is.
Let's hear it.
Do you think that the universe had a beginning?
I don't know. I would suspect yes.
You suspect yes?
Yeah, sure.
It does seem very clear to me that what Dinesh is doing is he's special pleading that because the Bible has a greater theological purpose behind it, that it is free. Oh, and also because it was written through human authors who could get things wrong, that therefore it's okay for there to be discrepancies, errors, mistakes, etc. I beg to differ. I think that perhaps if a God did purpose to reveal this very important message, that he would do it in such a way that he would not allow for such little menial things to be present there that would like trouble people from accepting its truth message, because it's either not corroborated in any evidence outside of the New Testament, or because it contains discrepancies and contradictions, and things of that nature. So
how did the writers of the book of Genesis know that?
I have no idea. It could, I mean, if I'm going to
They
be
guessed?
if I'm going to be cynical about this, if they did guess, it would be 50-50 guess. And I also think that if we had
Would
scientific,
it be a 50-50 guess?
yeah, because, and it might even be worse than that for you, because if we had some kind of scientific popular hypothesis, because of course the Big Bang might not have been the beginning of everything, who knows, right? But like whatever the popular scientific hypothesis is, if it were pointing to an infinite universe, for example, as Einstein thought we lived in, then I'm sure that people would open Genesis. They would say that in the beginning God created the heavens and the earth, and say that the earth just means the earth itself, right? Like I think it would be easily interpretable on either account.
All right. So one of my professors at Dartmouth was Robert Jastrow. He headed the Mount Wilson Laboratory, one of the great astronomers of the 20th century.
Sure.
So Jastrow writes in his book, God and the Astronomers, that for 250 years, modern science has been attempting to discover whether the universe had a beginning. And you can think of these scientists as ascending a very tall mountain in which there are many pathways. And for many years, with the steady state hypothesis and so on, there were beliefs that the universe was eternal. It never had a beginning. In fact, that was the prevailing point of view. And then Jastrow argues it's almost as if we reached the top of the mountain and there was a bunch of Hebrew prophets or theologians sitting there who had been there from the beginning. So I'm describing now a skeptic, a true skeptic and a true scientist, describing the scientific shock that attends to a discovery that, and I think it is out of the spirit of that discovery for you to go, oh yeah, I mean, it could have been this, it's like tossing a coin. It isn't like tossing a coin. This is a question that's been argued for 2 centuries and only resolved in the last several decades, and resolved decisively in one side and the other. And the fact that you're not willing to just straight out say, yeah, it is actually an astounding fact that we now know.
No. I mean, look, the scientific method has also revealed to us that the Earth was formed about 4.5 billion years ago. That is much later than the sun. The Gospel, the Old Testament account, the Hebrew Bible account tells us that it was the other way around. So got that bit wrong.
This argument is premised on a false interpretation of Genesis, in the sense that Genesis does not teach creation ex nihilo. And so, but he's claiming that it does, and pointing towards the Big Bang as that very moment when God created the universe. Kind of like, oh, science is corroborating the fact that there was a beginning of the universe, when it actually is not. Science does not teach that the Big Bang was like the very first beginning of the universe. It's simply as far back as we are able to interpret the evidence. This is as far back as the science can take us. But that is not to say, nor can it be ever said through science, through cosmology, that there was something that existed prior to the Big Bang. For all we know, it could have always existed, and the universe is simply oscillating between big bangs, if you want to call it that way. But my point is, scientists are not arguing that the universe had a beginning, and neither is Genesis teaching that as well. So that should take away the entire thrust of that argument.
You're making claims about the origin of the universe, especially in the case where if it is making a specific claim in the knowledge that there's a sort of infinite hypothesis and a beginning hypothesis, to take 50-50 stab, it's not amazing to me. It would be more amazing to me if everything lined up and it gave us an otherwise unknowable historical scientific account of the beginning of the universe. But as you say, that's not even what Genesis is trying to do.
But
so
it
I don't,
doesn't.
in other words, I don't understand how.
Yeah, I'm not saying that Genesis is trying to unfurl I'm saying that Genesis is making a statement about creation, and the statement about creation has a very startling scientific implication. Because if there was a creation, then there obviously wasn't something, and then there was something.
But I mean, it's not just science which can tell us that the universe had a beginning. I mean, like there are lots of philosophical arguments that people have made. Perhaps most famously, Al-Ghazali, who argues against for the impossibility of a past infinite universe. And I think does so quite convincingly, with no reference to redshifting and no reference to scientific hypotheses. So it's perfectly possible for somebody to take a pretty studious and educated guess at the fact that the universe had a beginning long before the scientific method told us that was the case.
I'm not saying that it's not possible to make philosophical arguments. And of course, as you know, there was a tradition in ancient Greece of making philosophical arguments all over the place.
So maybe that's why.
Let me keep going. It's my time. Let me pose.
I'm trying to answer a question. Maybe if you ask me how would they know, isn't this astounding? I would say, well, maybe they just had a philosophical tradition that taught the beginning of the universe, and that's where they got it from.
Except that it's not inconceivable, but it's not.
It's factual, because by the time Genesis comes around, there had already been other creation myths that spoke of a very similar thing happening. I talk about the Athrahasis, where there is not the Athrahasis, but the Enuma Elish, that involves a parting of the waters, a division of the waters. It involves an abyss, a chaos. It's describing that whole primordial narrative in Genesis of like the primitive creation or whatnot. It's something that is very well described by other Mesopotamian and Egyptian myths as well. So it's not really this original thing that came first, but they're more so answering to it. Like they're saying, yeah, this is how it came to be, more or less, but it was our God nonetheless who created it. And so it's really nothing new.
Likely because when we think of the tradition of Western civilization, we speak of Athens and
So
Jerusalem.
what I mean by that is, okay, so what if they got that right? And does that make Genesis true? Well, what about the other myths that were saying the same thing? Does that make them true as well? So should we be worshiping other creator gods?
And we speak of the origins of philosophy starting in about the 8th century BCE, and then really developing first in Greece. And then we talk about the tradition of revelation developing in ancient Jerusalem. So was there a hidden philosophical tradition? Possible, but probably unlikely. Let's proceed to the let's proceed to the issue of the veracity of some of the historical events described in the Bible. Would you say that figures like Jeremiah, David, are these historical figures or mythological figures?
I don't know for certain, but I would say that the Bible is certainly attempting to paint them as historical figures.
I forget what it's attempting to do. You've been trying to.
So I don't know. But
you don't know.
I'm
You have no
happy
idea.
to say yes.
Okay. So on a.
I would predict yes. I would say yes.
You would say
That's
yes.
what I would imagine. Yeah.
Okay. Do you think that Sodom and Gomorrah are historical cities?
Probably yeah.
Probably yes. Would you say that Pontius Pilate was a real person?
Yes.
Yes. Sure. Okay. Would you say that? All right. Now, these statements that you're saying now were in no way known to be true until recent decades. And
some of those, I'm not sure.
All the ones I
If
mentioned.
you're talking about like archaeology,
yeah, I'm talking biblical archaeology. Let me give you an example of what we're
archaeology
talking
can't prove the historical existence of a person very easily.
Well, let me go into this a little bit here.
And also, I don't like it's. You can. I want to make sure we're using the time wisely here. You could give me a sound archaeological bit of evidence that all of these people existed. That is in no way tells us about the truth of the stories that are attributed to them.
That's right.
No, it does. Well, let me put it this way. For many centuries, this is a whole tradition of biblical scholarship.
No, it doesn't, because even if, say, the existence of a King David at some point could be demonstrated, which, by the way, is highly debated still, that does not mean that all the events and the things that the books of the Old Testament as it pertains to David actually were true historical events. So I mean, there can be a way in which you can have these people be part of humanity's existence and whatnot, but not necessarily the things that were written down or said about them make them true just because these people existed. Same thing goes with historical with places as well. Like there's an ancient city of Jericho, for example. There's evidence of that, but did the events as described in the texts that talk about the conquest, did actually that take place just because there's evidence of a place? Just like just because New York City exists does not necessarily demonstrate or prove that Spider-Man is a real person.
19th century. In fact, really until in some cases 10, 15, or 20 years ago, there was absolutely no evidence historically for the existence, for example, of a Hezekiah, Jeremiah, David, let alone actual locations for David's palace.
Sure.
Hezekiah's tomb. All right. Hezekiah's
his tunnels.
Tunnels. Now, let me tell you something I discovered. I was getting a tour recently, a few months ago, in Israel from the guys at Hebrew University, and they were talking about an archaeologist named Elliot Mazar, who's what she calls herself a biblical archaeologist. She's not a Christian or even a believer, but the way that she does archaeology is this. She has the Bible in one hand and the pickaxe in the other. And the approach to it is pretty simple. It is, I want to find David's palace. Now, no one has ever heard of David's. I mean, David's palace is in the Bible, but there's no independent corroboration of it at all. There's a foundation in Jerusalem called the City of David Foundation. They have a little office. Dr. Elliot Mazar walks in their office and says to them, you have to move your office because the palace of David is in the ground underneath your office. And these guys are like, how would you know that? And Dr. Mazar says, because if you read the Bible, it will tell you that David, when he built his palace, brought in Phoenician builders who brought materials from Phoenicia and also brought Phoenician building expertise. The Phoenicians were apparently the builders of the day. And so Dr. Mazar says, we have found Phoenician seals, Phoenician coins, Phoenician inscriptions here. And so I predict that the palace is right underneath here because the Bible tells me that that's how that palace was built. So
David's palace exists.
David's palace is there for you to see today, and it is in the exact location of where it was said to be. And what I'm getting at is the archaeological approach here is to use the Bible as an archaeological tool. The location of Sodom and Gomorrah. There was a lot of speculation that said Sodom and Gomorrah was cities over here or cities over there, but actually makes no sense because A, what we know about Sodom and Gomorrah is that they were once flourishing cities. 2, they were burned to ashes. 3, Abraham supposedly could see the smoke from a long ways away. And so these locations of Sodom and Gomorrah were never found until recently. By recent, I mean recent decades. An archaeologist, again in the Eliot Mazar tradition, takes the Bible and says, for Sodom and Gomorrah to exist, it's not enough to just go looking and see if we find stuff and go, hey, is this Sodom and Gomorrah? Let's actually follow the tracks of the Bible. Let's follow the map provided admittedly in very sketchy terms. The Bible is not trying to give you a map, but it's giving you clues. And based on these clues, the actual Sodom and Gomorrah is located, and you dig into it, and guess what? You find the remains of an ancient city, and you also find ash and...
Again, just because the Bible got it right that there was such a city named Sodom and Gomorrah does not mean that sulfur came raining down from heaven. Okay, it's just plain and simple.
And debris. In other words, there was an ancient city there. It was completely burned to the ground. So one of the great cities of the ancient world then becomes an absolute nothing, and has been an absolute nothing since. And not only does the Bible describe these events, but it says exactly that these great cities will cease to exist and will never be resurrected again as they have not been to this day.
If I may, because I'm beginning to suspect this isn't the question, I might just jump in here. Sure, yeah, okay. So the authors of the Hebrew Bible. So
my conclusion,
if I might answer the question. I mean, it is your time, but I need to be able to speak as well. The Bible contains accurate data about where archaeologically we can find the ruins of ancient cities. Okay.
By the way, I was not aware of this whole archaeological finding of David's palace, but I am reading an article from the Times of Israel, which is not an archaeology journal. Maybe that's what that needs to come out from. But it says that Mazar's conclusion about the palace is controversial. Archaeologists from Tel Aviv University contend that her overly literal reading of the biblical text skews her analysis of the archaeological record. And that essentially what you have there is like evidence of material evidence that would correspond to 1000 BC, or the time, right around the time where David is believed to have captured Jerusalem. And that's why this may be David's palace. But when I read the word controversial, that means not everybody agrees. So I wonder if that's really the case. I'll see if I can ask an expert and get some insight on that.
That's not too extraordinary to me. I have no problem saying that the people who wrote these texts knew where these places were with exact precision. And in fact, notice what's happening. Notice what's happening, in my view. What's happening is that the Bible is a historical text, a scientific text when it needs to be, and it's not one when you don't want it to be. So when I said a moment ago, here's a relatively mundane historical fact about the Gospels, you said, well, the fact that some mundane historical fact should undermine Christianity is ludicrous. But now you're telling me that a mundane historical fact is enough to buttress Christianity. I don't think you can have your cake and eat it too in that case.
I'm not trying to have my cake and eat it too. I'm simply saying that if somebody gives a true account of events, complete with small details that are incidental to the narrative, the Bible refers to very minor figures at times. Let's take, for example, Caiaphas. Caiaphas is one of the 2 high priests who was present at Jesus' trial. We don't even know his first name. He's mentioned as Caiaphas. The historian Josephus calls him Josephus Caiaphas. And that is the only indication from Josephus, and only one source, and a source writing a little later, of what this guy's name even was. And until recently, a few decades ago, there was absolutely no corroboration that there was ever a guy even named Caiaphas. Except now, not only do we have inscriptions with his name, we actually have his bones.
But Dinesh, what does this matter?
Okay, so what I'm getting at
what
is...
does this matter at all to the question?
Why does it matter?
Why does this matter?
Because if somebody is giving a true account of events, you know, a guy comes running into this room and he goes, guess what? I've just witnessed a murder. He's going to give us a lot of accounts and a lot of detail, right? Now,
look, if somebody was trying to claim that Moses parted the Red Sea, and I said, well, how could you possibly know that's the case? And you said, well, look, we didn't have any evidence that a guy called Moses existed, but we've discovered this rock where someone wrote Moses was here.
No.
Great, okay, we know Moses existed, and maybe we know where he existed. But the actual events, the stories that are attributed to these characters are in no way supported by anything that you're saying. And that's the important thing. I think that's what people are interested in. I doubt that anybody in this room, and they can make themselves known if they're here, I don't think anybody in this room either thinks that it's important or is troubled in their skepticism by the existence of these people and the real existence of places that are described in the Old Testament.
Right, and neither do I think that a single Christian believer in the world would be shaken by anything that you've said today. So let's really try to meet in the middle on the stuff that really matters. And I think think what we're really saying, when you mention the parting of the Red Sea, to me, it's like, now we're talking. Because we're talking about,
These are different.
these are categorically different types of events.
I mean, what you just said, these are different because people are troubled by what I say and they're not troubled by what you say. Because for an atheist to say that Hezekiah existed doesn't mean they can't be an atheist. For a Christian to say that Jesus didn't historically rise from the dead means that they're not a Christian.
Correct.
So these are different. They're asymmetrical.
They're asymmetrical. So let's pick up the.
So it matters. It matters when the historical elements are wrong in terms of our grand conclusion. For the Christian, it matters when the history gets it wrong. For the atheist, it doesn't matter when the history gets it right.
That's right. Very good, Alex, for bringing it back to the real issue, which is primarily Jesus. And so Dinesh, you're still not being able to answer to his objections regarding the credibility of the Gospels.
What I'm saying is that if someone gives a true account of events, it is normal for the accounts to vary, to differ, in some cases to have minor contradictions. Sure. The real question is did the thing that's being described actually happen?
Okay, so
let's turn to that.
Do you think, for example, that the slaughter of the Amalekites that I mentioned before actually happened?
Probably, of course.
And if that happened, I mean, we haven't spoken about the concept of moral truth. I'd like to get time to
we can come to that, but let's stay with what I think you were about to get to, which I think is the heart of the matter that we haven't even gotten to, and that's this. The Bible is where the Bible is the most unbelievable is in its account of astounding and miraculous events. Sure. Right? Healings. Let's take the most.
This is a great question. Could the Israelites have absorbed Mesopotamian myths during their captivity in Babylon? I think it's possible. What is more likely the case, as I'm hearing scholars like Joshua Bowen and Kip Davis, is that they were more like answering to those myths, like they're providing a rebuttal, so to speak. So not necessarily inspired, like, "Ooh, we have no idea how the world came to be. Let's say what the Mesopotamians have been saying for 1,000 years." Not necessarily. I think they were more responding to, in the sense like, yeah, that's maybe sort of, but it's like our God did it, or our God is more powerful than yours. And so there's sort of a retelling or rebranding. I think it's a better way of describing it.
Outrageous event of all, which is, let's just say, bringing a guy back from the dead. Yep. Presented in the Bible as a miracle.
Talking about Lazarus here.
I'm talking about Lazarus. Yes, Lazarus. Perfect. Now,
thank you.
A Christian would say this: A, the Bible doesn't try to prove it; it simply asserts it. In fact, it presents it as a truth of revelation, if you will. God revealed this. It's a miracle, which is to say that it is not something that happens within the seeming known laws of nature, which we'll talk about in a moment. And the question really here is, are these kinds of miracles possible? If you say, are they implausible, or are they rare, or is it difficult to believe? The Christian is like right with you.
I think the question is, did they happen?
Did they happen? Right? And the Christian, here's where the Christian.
And it's like he just agreed with Alex, but in his mind, what he's still thinking is, oh, but is it possible? Because that's really all they have. It's like, well, maybe it's because of this, and is that possible? But that's the wrong question. The right question is, did it actually take place? And if so, is there enough evidence? Is the quality of the evidence the right type of evidence to back up such claims? And I think not.
The atheists are on common ground, because the Christian and the atheist would both say that based upon ordinary experience, it can't happen. Sure. Because otherwise it wouldn't be a miracle.
So what evidence might we have to suggest that these miraculous events as described in the Gospels did happen?
I'm saying that because the miraculous events, the Christian would simply say, if God exists, miracles are obviously possible.
Sure, I agree.
The atheist has a higher burden. And that is, the atheist has to say that whether or not God exists, which is not the topic of our debate here, miracles are impossible. Because if they're possible...
They don't have to say that.
You don't have to say that?
No, of course they don't have to say that.
You don't have to say that. You say it is possible for a man to be raised from the dead.
I can say that that's possible without thereby...
But you're saying that this particular one didn't happen, but the event is possible.
Without thereby in any way telling us anything about whether it happened as reported.
Is it possible for the Red Sea to be parted?
I mean, it's possible to bring somebody back from the dead within a reasonable time and given the right conditions. I mean, you ever heard of like artificial resuscitation? That is such a thing, although death is sort of a tricky thing, because death is more of a process rather than just a switch that turns off the lights. It depends on the conditions of the dying, and it's usually a lengthy process. It takes time. Even after your heart stops beating, the brain's still somewhat functioning, and it's within that initial frame where jump starting the heart again could bring that person back from what would have been otherwise an impending death. Um, but that's something we can understand. That's something that we can attribute to the science, to the medical professionals, to the equipment, and through man's modern understanding of human biology. But what's happening here is all this is being attributed to a God as a miracle without any of the human knowledge and the technology and the tools. And that's where the problem is,
Sure, why not?
It is.
Okay.
Okay.
But
Is it possible for
yes, but what does that do for us? Is it possible that Muhammad flew to heaven on a winged horse?
Okay, so here's our problem.
Well, yes or no?
Yes, of course it's possible.
Of course it's possible. So that means that the miraculous events as described in Islam, you've got such a higher burden of proof than the Muslim does if you're having a debate with a Muslim.
But
because you have to.
I am not trying to prove the veracity of this or that miracle. I freely admit that I can't do
I'm
that.
not trying to prove the veracity.
But you can't disprove it either.
No, of course I can't disprove it.
Exactly.
That's not my task here. That's like me saying, I think that, I don't know, to take a Shakespearean example, I think that, spoiler alert,
But we don't need Shakespearean example.
Romeo took the poison.
Let's take an actual.
And if you said, well, hold on, how do you know that actually happened? And I said, well, you can't prove that it didn't.
Well, let's take an actual example that pertains to Christianity. Let's talk about something I raised earlier.
We've got 5 minutes before Q&A.
Okay. Do you believe that there's life after death?
I don't know.
You have no idea.
Yeah, I'm agnostic on that.
So if I say that there's life after death, am I being unreasonable?
I don't think so.
Not at all.
It depends on your reasons.
It depends on my reasons, but what I'm saying is if I were to tell you that there is no empirical way to prove this one way or the other, my faith, let's say, that there's life after death is just as reasonable as someone who says there isn't.
Sure, it depends on what the reasons that are given are, of course, but sure.
We're talking about the reasons that are actually available. Not the person who's giving a reason may give the best or not the best reason.
I'm happy to say yes. I just want to be careful what I say because people might get the wrong impression of my beliefs. But yeah, sure. I mean, sure. We've got two people. One says life after death. One says not. They're both just as reasonable.
They're both just as reasonable.
Sure. Yeah.
Okay. Excellent. Okay. Good. I wanted to clarify that point particularly because
what it really with the truth of the Bible.
Well, all I am saying is that the claims of miracles, you and I are not going to be in a position to go back and see whether or not Jesus raised a man from the dead.
That's
right?
not all you said. It's not all you're saying.
The Christian is perfectly willing to take that on faith.
You think that did happen, and you're taking it on faith, and that's fine. Like,
yes.
More power to you. In fact, I envy your ability to believe things despite the.
Well, don't you take a lot of things on faith?
Of course, yeah, absolutely.
Plenty of things on faith.
Yeah, all the time.
So all the things that you take on faith are things that you think are not unreasonable, but the things that Christians take on faith are to you unreasonable because they can't be corroborated with historical evidence.
Is that what I said? I don't remember saying that.
So are the Christian beliefs on faith just as reasonable as everything that you believe on faith?
It can be depending on the reasons, but the veracity of the gospel accounts and the Old Testament prophecy, I think, is unreasonable to believe in. Not life after death, that's fine, you can believe that. Not like, a man called Jesus rose from the dead, fine. But the idea that the Bible comports with reality either in a mythological sense, in an allegorical sense, in a moral sense, or in a history, in the sense of
Let's talk about the moral sense, since you raised it, and we'll just talk about briefly.
We've got time for Q&A, but look, I can reread the text if you like. The Amalekites.
Well, let's not talk about the Amalekites, in part because here's the problem. For most Christians, the Old Testament is different than the New and is seen through the light of the New. So if you want to go to, Dennis Prager, who has written about this from a Jewish perspective, has written about the Deuteronomy, the Book of Kings, the Amalekites,
so we can bring him out
what he considers to be the justifiable massacre of the Canaanites. I don't really want to go there because
I know why you don't want to go there.
Well, the reason I don't want to go there, the Old Testament is full of horrific massacres.
Yes, and
that is hold on,
massacres which are ordained,
massacres which appear to be ordained by Yahweh directly. Sure. Agreed. And
why are you saying Yahweh instead of God? Why are you trying to distance yourself from the God of the Old Testament?
Well, I'm not trying to distance myself. I'm simply trying to say that any reader.
So why is that the first time you've used the word Yahweh?
Because this is such a typical thing of Christians to do, is like, well, but that was just the Old Testament God, right? Yeah, but that's there are no two gods. It's the Father in Christianity is that same God supposedly. So why should we give special pleading to a God that give it a different name? That's what he's trying to do, is distance himself, basically.
I'll tell you why. Because there is a movement within the Bible itself that you are completely missing.
Do not think that I've come to abolish the law or the prophets. I have not come to abolish them, but to fulfill them. For truly I tell you, until heaven and earth disappear, not the smallest letter, not the least stroke of a pen, will by any means disappear from the law until everything is accomplished. Therefore, anyone who sets aside one of the least of these commands and teaches accordingly will be called least in the kingdom of heaven. But whoever practices and teaches these commands will be called great in the kingdom of heaven. Jesus said that in the Sermon on the Mount, referring to his fulfillment of Old Testament prophecy and law.
Referring to his fulfillment of Old Testament prophecy.
Old Testament law.
That's right. If Jesus did say those things, then Jesus did not presume that there would be a New Testament coming up, amending an Old Testament. He pretty much said something like, this is the Bible, and that Bible stays the same.
And what I'm referring to here is an Old Testament law, which you're now trying to distance yourself from. And say that it's sort of
I'm saying that
that's not what Jesus thought.
I'm saying you're missing the developmental track of the Bible that is obvious to any intelligent reader. Let me give you one example of what I'm talking about.
Tell me about the Amalekites. Tell me what the developmental.
It's not about the Amalekites. It's about the way that the whole story of the Bible changes in tone and mood and message.
But
I mean,
Dinesh,
for example,
help me out here. Like, just tell me where, any way you like. Tell me where this fits into that trajectory.
Okay, I'll tell you where.
We have just a couple minutes, guys, so let's wrap it up before the Q&A.
Just tell me.
The underlying message of the Old Testament is an eye for an eye. The Amalekites are the enemies of the Israelites. The Israelites will crush them with the same venom that the Amalekites would have crushed the Israelites. That's called an eye for an eye.
Including
Now,
the
hold on.
The children, the infants,
The children,
the
the
cattle,
infants,
the sheep, the camels, the donkeys.
Yeah, that Dennis Prager says yes, but my point is different. You will not find that spirit at all in the New Testament. In fact, in the New Testament, you've got a spirit of forgiveness. So what I'm getting at is to pretend like you don't have this.
So like people burning in hell for not believing in Jesus, in his resurrection, is not the same cruelty. And then you have so many things that go on that happen during the Gospels, like the massacre of the kids, of the babies, because of Jesus. Like, well, how come the God of the New Testament, didn't stop that from happening? I beg to differ. I think the God of the New Testament is just as cruel as the Old Testament, only with a little a little amendments to his policies of taking care of those who oppose him. That's it.
I mean,
Christianity is named after Christ. It's based on Christ as a fulfillment of the Old Testament. But what is fulfillment?
Which, by the way, is not a light thing, in my opinion. To become a Christian, it basically means that you give yourself over to God, like 100%. You die to self in order to gain. It's a way of just completely giving up on this life because there's another life coming up. I mean, that is a high stake.
Fulfillment mean? It actually means transcendence. In Abraham's time, blood sacrifices are normal, right? When Christ comes as a sacrifice.
Oh, and not only that, but the relationship of the believer with the God in the New Testament is described as one like a slave as well. So I beg to differ.
Christ is the Lamb. The point is, those blood sacrifices aren't necessary anymore. That's the Christian reading. And you keep filibustering me because you know that the Bible is showing a movement in a direction, and to miss the movement is to miss the Bible. Let's look at God in the Bible. Let me make one quick point.
There's nothing quick about what you're doing, Dinesh. There's nothing quick about what you're doing. I need to be allowed to respond to what you're saying. I'm getting sick whenever
you're cross-examining me on the justice of smiting the Amalekites. Honestly, I don't see any justice in it, but I do agree that was the eye for an eye ethic of the Old Testament that is repudiated and transformed and transfigured in the New.
I've had this conversation so many times.
Really? Okay, so if your right eye causes you to sin, gouge it out. I mean, I think that goes beyond eye to eye.
Craig, at least he had the gall to just tell me that yes, that was a moral thing for God to do. I get sick to death of people hand waving away this genocide by some vague reference to the fact that Jesus came along to do something which somehow kind of undoes the immorality of it. Like, this is not an eye for an eye. This is a genocide of combatant men, innocent women, and children, and animals. Saul is punished by God for not killing all of the animals. Like, that is actually a ludicrous misreading of what's happening. Let me check in. I have to make this point.
Okay.
I've got to read the text from Joshua as well.
Okay, and then we'll check in with the audience because we're probably, I think the audience is going to agree that we want this to keep going instead of going to Q&A, but we'll check in just after Alex's point.
I think it's important. Like, read these texts for yourself. There's no way that I'm misreading this text. We know that this is what's happening. In the slaughter of Ai, that's a type of Canaanite. In Joshua, we're told that when Israel had finished killing all of the men in Ai, in the fields and in the wilderness, where they had chased them, and when every one of them had been put to the sword, the Israelites returned to Ai and killed those who were in it. That is to say, that we're told that this is just because the promised land was inhabited, and God's God, he's allowed to do this. So because the Israelites want that land, they have to go and chase out the Ai. So they chase them into the wilderness. They chase after them. They slaughter them in the wilderness. They then turn around, come back into the city, and kill who's left. Who's left if the combatants have run away? The women and the children. This is intolerable, and I cannot have it simply waved away.
All right, hang on. Let me just for a second.
It can't happen. It can't keep happening.
You're completely blind to the irony of what you're saying.
Dinesh, can we pause for just a second?
Yeah.
Okay, everyone who wants to go to Q&A right now, make a loud noise. We're gonna let
just war tradition, according to which the slaughter of women and children is out of bounds. Prior to Christianity, no one thought this. Everybody did it, and everybody today does it everywhere in the world, and we do it too. The bombing of Dresden, the bombing of Hamburg, Hiroshima and Nagasaki. The incineration of women and children is the normal course of war. I just watched a World War II documentary in which they interview an old bomber, a U.S. bomber pilot, and he goes, I was given a bombing mission to hit a target. I asked the U.S. authorities, who's in the building? They said 20,000 women and children. And this guy kind of breaks down. You can watch this on Netflix. And he goes, I'm like, what the hell? You want me to kill 20,000 women and children? He goes, we're supposed to be the good guys. And he goes, but I couldn't repudiate the order. It was an order, so I did it. So What I'm getting at is
that everybody does it.
it is not ethical. It is not. But I'm simply saying, Alex, that you are a product of the Christian morality that repudiates it now. You're standing on a Christian mountain and acting like, whoa, look at these Christians. They taught you to talk like this.
These people did not teach me to think like that.
They did.
These people were listening to their God who was telling them to slaughter innocent women.
That's right. The ancient Israelites were. But the ancient Israelites are not what taught you. What taught you is the 1,000-year tradition of the early Christian church.
Which came a bit too late for the Amalekites.
It came a bit too late for the Amalekites, to be sure.
Were the Israelite armies not instructed by the God that you believe in?
They were instructed by God.
And they were instructed to do things which you would now consider to be immoral, yes?
Absolutely.
So God has commanded them to do something which you now consider to be immoral. Whether or not you consider it to be immoral, with the later developments of Christian ethics, God himself has told us that we must abandon our intuition that the slaughter of women and children, and by the way, when it's unnecessary in those instances to slaughter them.
I don't view it that way. This is how I view it. Let's put it this way. Even in the ancient world, divine revelation comes into a primitive, barbaric world, which is full of a lot of really bad guys.
Yeah, so that's complete mischaracterization of the ancient world. In fact, prior to the Bible, certainly before Christianity, there were civilizations around them that had well-defined law and moral codes written down and established. And for you to sit here and say that the biblical context is one in which the whole world is full of barbarians, that is just a complete mischaracterization of history and of the entire world. Actually, that's not the case.
And God says, keep going.
No,
God
does not say keep going. But what God does is and again, this is called, trying to get the point of what is happening. There's slavery in this world, in the ancient world, and it is true. The Bible doesn't come in and go, we denounce slavery, we denounce the killing of women and children. It doesn't do that. It actually immerses itself into an existing, admittedly barbaric culture. And what's actually going on there with the Amalekites, the Canaanites, and so on.
And so does that mean that the author or divine inspirator of the Bible is now excused for not forbidding slavery, for instance? That's not good enough.
Who, by the way, in the Old Testament does not act like a monotheistic God. He acts like a tribal God, right? He acts like the God of only the Israelites.
And so Israel's enemies. Listen to what you just said. The God that you believe in is acting like a tribal war god.
The God of the God that is depicted in the Old Testament is he goes, I'm picking the Jews. Yes. I'm choosing you.
To the extent that
your enemies become my enemies.
To the extent that your male and female slaves may come from the nations around you. From them you may buy and sell slaves. You may also purchase some of the temporary residents living among you and members of their clan born in your town. You can bequeath them to your children as inheritable property. This is human beings, by the way. But you must not rule over your fellow Israelites ruthlessly. So not only do we have the description of slavery in the Old Testament, we have an explicit condoning instructions on how to do it and doing it based on race.
That's right.
Well, I wouldn't say based on race, because
how else do you
first of all, racism is an invention of the modern
tribe.
world.
Call it tribe if you like.
These are clans.
You treat
these are militaristic
Israelite slaves
clans.
this way, and treat non-Israelite slaves this way. By the way that the
Yeah, but certainly Jews did see others with a different lens, and I think one of those lines of demarcation is clearly circumcision, setting them apart from other races or cultures that would not.
Aren't let go after 7 years at all in the first place. Now, I understand what you're saying when you say, hold on, when you say, like, okay, maybe God couldn't have abolished slavery for some reason, but at least, for example, when the male slave goes free, let his wife and children go with him.
Yeah.
Why not this simple moral improvement? There is no conceivable reason that this could not have been ordained by God, but it was not.
You have a capital argument here to be had with the rabbis, and look, there is a massive rabbinical tradition that discusses every fine point, as you know. But it's not my job to
I'm not a rabbi
isolate the Old Testament from the New and justify ancient battles that have no bearing. Look at this way. If someone were to listen to you, they would have no idea that the first anti-slavery movement in the world is driven by the Quakers and the evangelical Christians. They read the same Bible, but evidently they don't read it your way, because if they read it your way, they would be the prime apologists and defenders of slavery. So
yeah, but that would be because, if that's true, that perhaps they had a bit of a humanist in them, not because the Bible instructed them otherwise.
The early anti-slavery movements are about 1710, 1720.
Here's two hypotheses then. One hypothesis is that God actually didn't like slavery the whole time. It just took human beings literally thousands of years to work it out, and that just so happened to coincide with the Enlightenment. That's one hypothesis. Another hypothesis is actually that the Bible does condone slavery, and that what's going on is, I think, for example, when you look at the actual verses that are being given as justification for the Christian abolitionist movement, what kind of verses are we talking about?
Well, what I'm saying is that first of all, the Enlightenment,
Christians who did it, but to say that they were doing it as motivated by Christianity is a different kind of claim.
It is a very significant claim because to you, the Bible exists in an interpretive tradition that has been expostulated over many centuries by Christians. They're reading that Bible. They're reading it with great care as to what it's trying to say. And And the Enlightenment, far from being the origin of any of this, in fact, the racism that came out of the Enlightenment was of a species that never existed before. I mean, you think of the great philosophers like Hegel, Kant, their denunciations of blacks, for example, you'll find nothing like that in the Old Testament, leave alone the New.
And if modern Enlightenment thinkers were beholden to think that
That would
these
be
Enlightenment thinkers were
anachronistic,
ineffable,
idiot.
creators of an inviolable ethic, then we'd probably have had a harder time getting rid of it, don't you think?
Well, nobody.
Do you think the abolitionists?
But it's not the point. The point is the Bible is setting a legal precedent for discriminating against those who are not like us, starting with beliefs, and then all the way to even the color of the skin, because Christianity has made a very strong point in that Jesus is white.
Movement was helped or hindered by the existence of the verses that I've just described.
Well, I mean,
Come on.
I think it was hindered by them because I think that the Southern apologists of slavery appealed to those verses. To be sure, they appealed to the Old Testament verses
And
that were pro-slavery.
tell me where you could appeal to be anti-slavery specifically. I mean, not love your enemy, love your neighbor. Tell me specifically. Like, here's how I can put it: you're in a time machine. You go back to antebellum slavery in the American South.
Yeah.
And the thing about love your neighbor, like, who's really the neighbor that you're loving? Because I don't think what was in mind was foreigners, but more so other Hebrews or other Jews.
You find yourself on a plantation and you say to the master of the house, you own a bunch of slaves. I don't think this is moral. I don't think you should be mistreating them. Where do they turn? And plausibly so, to justify what they're doing.
Well, the answer
They pull out
is
their
this.
Bible, and you can say to them, well, hold on, have you read this verse? Tell me the verse. Tell me where I can point this person in order to dispel them of their
So I
ideas
would
about
recommend to you a compendium of sermons that were delivered by Northern preachers in the decades leading up to the Civil War. Hold on.
I want to know what the verses
Right,
are.
so I'm going to give you their mode of preaching, because the key to it is to understand how they use the Bible. It's not the way you do it. Even the Southern theologians weren't dumb enough to say they enslaved the Amalekites, therefore you can enslave this guy who's here from the Congo. No, the Southerners didn't use those arguments either. Your arguments are in a different species altogether. If you look at the arguments between the Northerners and Southerners over slavery, they were far more nuanced than that. Basically, you have to do something like this. The Northern theologians would say this: are we or are we not created equal in the eyes of God? Yes or no? Yes. Are we all equally in need of salvation? Yes. Does God therefore love us all equally and make salvation available to us all? Yes.
And then
And all that being the case, so hold on. It takes a movement now to go from this theological truth to a political application. But I don't have to prove that this is plausible because it already happened.
It's far too vague. It's
far too vague for you. It's far, from a skeptical compass, it's vague.
This always happens.
But I'm saying millions of people believed it. They listened to these sermons. They acted on them.
That's because people retrospectively impart their own values.
Why do you think people in the North who had no stake in the matter signed up to fight the Civil War? Why did they do it?
I don't know.
You have no idea, right? You have no clue.
I don't think it's because they read the Bible.
I'm saying that you realize
look at the sermons that are being given. Look at the language that's being used. People talk about the Exodus story, for example. The enslaved in Egypt, freed by God and brought into the promised land. And this is a story that is favored. This is a story that's favored by abolitionists to say, look at this anti-slavery spirit, something like Exodus, leaving out the fact that when the Israelites are liberated from Egypt and trying to take the promised land, they do so by slaughtering, genociding, and also then enslaving the people who are already living there. They leave out that bit. Because if they kept it in, then we'd realize that God did not have an anti-slavery essence. God had an anti-Israelite oppression.
Not only that, but for example, the Levites, who become essentially the tribe in charge of or responsible for maintaining temple grounds and serving the priesthood. Their whole premise of them not being able to partake of businesses and own land and all these other things is in part because Yahweh's perspective for having them as like the dedicated tribe to serve the temple is because Yahweh is seeing them as like slaves as well. It's sort of like Yahweh liberated, 90% of the ancient Israelites in the Exodus, which we know didn't necessarily happen that way, but we'll play along. But kept sort of a tithe or a percentage of that population that he liberated and made free over to himself to serve him as slaves would do, which is bizarre.
Okay.
Sentiment.
Well,
and it's in the Old Testament specifically the Israelites whose oppression he's upset with, and not only fine with the oppression of others, but mandates the oppression of others through the Israelites.
Okay, and all I'm saying is that there is a whole tradition that involves millions of slaves, millions of abolitionist preachers, Martin Luther King, none of them, not one of them, reads this story your way.
They just don't mention it. They just don't mention it.
Right, but isn't the significance of a text determined by the reading and use to which it is put? Let's say, for example, there's a story of murder, and everybody who reads that story becomes a wonderful citizen, loves their family, and you're the only guy who goes, oh no, really, guys, you're all misreading the text. It's really about murder, guys. And Martin Luther King goes, no. Slaves for hundreds of years have taken consolation in the Exodus. I mean, go down, Moses, way down to Egypt land and tell old Pharaoh, let my people go. To you, this is gobbledygook, because guess what the Israelites did next? And then Martin Luther King goes,
what did they do next?
well, my point.
Like, what I would say to Martin Luther King,
I agree about the description of the Bible. I'm simply saying that
Dinesh.
a Christian book has got to be understood in the way Christians understand it. And if you come out with a quote, let's just say, for example,
don't put it in scare quotes. Like you can say, go to
That's
bed.
not the point, because what's in the debate here is what is the most appropriate understanding or interpretation of the New Testament. The question of the debate is the Bible true? And so the only way that that question can be answered is if we look at all the different truth claims of the Bible and look for evidence for each and every one of them. And he has done nothing of that. Dinesh has just been skating around that question. He has yet to deal with any of Alex O'Connor's objections and raised flags in terms of the credibility of the New Testament and so forth, as well as all of the other moral problems that can be found throughout the Bible that would otherwise make be describing an evil God. And so this is not what the debate's about, Dinesh. It is obvious that you either don't know what to say or know the problem and know that there's not really an answer to those objections. You have no excuse.
Pharaoh and say, let my people go. And if I was trying to make a theological point, I would say, and then do what? What did they do next? Like, don't get me wrong. I am more than happy that Martin Luther King was able to make a theological case for the abolition of slavery. Fine. But I would say that he was...
Not for the abolition of slavery, but for civil rights.
He was misreading the text. Yeah, you're right.
We have about 5 minutes,
Not
guys.
the other way around. It's like, we have to ask who's misreading the text. And let's just suppose for a moment that you could point to me, which you still haven't done, to a single verse, even in the New Testament, which tells me that slavery is a bad thing, which, by the way, St. Paul writes in... I can't remember which. I wish I could remember which letter it is. But you'll know what I'm talking about, where he writes, "Slaves, be obedient to your masters, not just the good ones, but also to the cruel," or "fruit," as the King James has it. Like, if it were the case that even if you could, which I'd still love you to do, point to a single verse in the New Testament that tells me that slavery is actually not so good, the fact that so obviously God is okay with it in the Old Testament means that even if you could do that, the best we're left with is that we have a text here which can say one thing on one day and another thing the next.
If you don't understand, if you don't read,
I'm sure I bribed more people than that on the way in. So.
If you don't read the Bible in the way that the Christians do, then I'm trying to understand what is you're essentially a kind of a new interpreter who's saying that, first of all, texts are always open to interpretation, right? So if I say, for example, the meaning of the Oedipus story,
Again, Dinesh, it's not about interpretation. It's about whether or not it's true.
and that is the meaning of the Sophoclean hero. The Sophoclean hero is isolated, Antigone, Oedipus. They hold on to a truth no matter what, however unpleasant, however dangerous. It often takes them to their destruction or their death.
Sounds like you.
And that is the way in which let's just say a student of ancient Greek drama, reads this work. And that is the way that the work has always been read. You come along and say, let's just say you're Sigmund Freud, and you go, no, to me, the work really means something completely different. People have a secret lust for their moms. And this is repressed. Now, it's a very interesting interpretation, but it's sort of like I'm telling you, no Christian reads it that way. You're like, but there it is in the text.
Sometimes a genocide is just a genocide.
I'm not denying the facts as described. It's the wiping out of the Amalekites.
Yeah, as ordained by the God that you believe in.
As ordered by Yahweh. So
just to ask you a direct yes or no question, and appreciate a direct yes or no to this. The God that you believe in is the moral author of the universe. Morally justifiably commanded the slaughter of innocent children and women. Yes or no?
In the Old Testament, yes.
There you have it. So now we've covered historical, metaphorical, allegorical, and now moral truth. And I suppose it can only be up to the audience to decide whether they think that this is true.
Fair enough. Okay.
All right, everyone, let's do a big round of applause for Dinesh and Alex. Wow.
All right, folks, as
Sorry
we
about
bring this to a close, I want to say, first of all, thank you for those that stuck through the live. I do appreciate the likes and the shares. Although what I do plan on doing with this video is I'm going to likely download it and then repost it as an actual video and not a live because they get terrible views. But I do appreciate the interaction. I will display the comments that were that popped up throughout the debate. And thank you for everything, guys. Yeah, and what else? Anyone have any questions or any comments last second? Let's see here. Some of these were really good. Levites were allowed to work in the temple, says P. Matra. I hope I'm pronouncing this right. Out of them, Aaronites were allowed to be high priests. Korahites were allowed to be porters. There was an Aaronite-Korahite power struggle. Interesting. Korahites were driven out. Korahites wrote the Quran. Muhammad comes from the Quraysh tribe. No wonder Muslims want to control Jerusalem. That is interesting, and that's something that I like to know more about. And then finally, Alex was the tribal war god Yahweh, and Dinesh his sad victim. That's funny. All righty, folks. Well, thanks for watching, and until next time, this has been Apostate of Mind.
They call me a god. 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 Let's go. I'm about to go off like a weapon. Fuel to the top, got a filled up engine. In my thoughts, obsession. I will not stop, no, I'm never second guessing. I got a God complex. Haters love to hate, but I never feel pressed. Got a lot on my plate, but I never get stressed. I'll take all the pressure like I'm acing this test. Tear it up like I'm Jason. I see the world like it's ready for the taking. I see this place like a game I'm playing. Straight to the bank to collect my payments. No negotiations, it's my way, I was born impatient.